That's ridiculous. Alright. I'm going in. Welcome, welcome, one and all, friends and fam and foes, to another episode of Agent Smith. This marks the 25th episode of this broadcast, where we talk with your very own codename Agent Smith about the world, what has happened, why it's happened, the actors involved, and just trying to untangle the web and the mess that is politics, history, and war. Let's begin. I'm gonna jump into the channel now. Ahoy there, Agent Smith.
Hello.
Greetings.
Hey, how are you?
Bananas. How are you?
I'm doing alright.
That's good. We had a very standard week. It was a mixed bag, felt about normal.
Mm.
Which we'll take those. That's no problem.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. Nice mellow week.
Yeah. Yours?
Pretty much the same.
That's good.
Mostly banging my head against the wall trying to figure out StarCraft's editor.
StarCraft's editor? What have you been doing in that?
Just fiddling around, trying to modify models and stuff like that.
That's cool.
Somewhat tricky to do.
The second StarCraft or the first one?
Second one.
Sweet.
Yeah, first one would be easier, because those are 2D models.
Mm-hmm.
3D models are a bit more tricky, especially if you don't have the money for a $200 a month 3DS Max subscription.
Wow. That sounds like a very fancy software.
Mm, that's the impression I get.
That's only for the elite and wealthy.
Yeah, or students, since they apparently get a free account.
Oh my goodness. Just tell them you're a student. You're basically a student.
I may lack proof.
Damn. Well, so what's been going on in the world this week?
Not a whole lot. Nothing really dramatic happened. There's nothing that I can remember. Just little things here and there.
Did anything blow up?
I don't think so.
Hmm.
At least not any more so than usual.
Oh, did you hear about the naked guy who shot up a Waffle House?
Yeah. Yeah, I read that. That was colorful.
Can't people eat their waffles in peace?
No, clearly not. Yeah, he was probably high on something, I would suspect.
He was also probably an asshole.
Well, the two are not mutually exclusive.
There have been quite a few people who ask about guns. I know we always have the gun discussion every week. And the crypto question. Those are the two favorite topics of the internet, apparently. But one of the things that I kind of think about is the ease of access of having a very powerful weapon, and just the notion of people get grumpy about stuff. I think that's one of the universal human aspects is it doesn't matter what country you're from, you can get grumpy, like really pissed off about stuff. And then it's kind of the question of in what ways can you influence your surroundings when you're in that state, and how can you manage that state? It's a bit of a clusterfuck. I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what we should do, but we certainly have no shortage of guns here, that's a fact.
Yeah, it just depends on how people want to allocate risk. You know, whatever policy you implement is going to have its benefits and costs. So balancing them is how the public is going to ultimately decide what it wants to go with. Or people will just yell at each other and try to impose solutions on the other half of the population. They could try that too.
Yeah, shouting at each other is something we're very good at. Oh, did you watch that politicians and legislation and stuff, like them fighting each other?
Yeah, I saw that video you sent me.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, that guy from Uganda, man, he was really good. Caught that chair like a pro.
I don't know how much you know about hockey. I think that is one of your main sports you follow, right?
Pretty much the only one.
And how they have
followed it as much.
Well, back when I used to watch hockey, which was like 90s and early aughts, teams had enforcers. It's less so that way now, but you would have some dedicated fighters who were actually kind of bad in terms of shot accuracy and making big plays and stuff, but they had a lot of the beat up the other team potential if it came to terms. So I was thinking it'd be really funny if different houses of legislature representation and stuff, they had some enforcers as well. So if it broke out into a brawl, your party would win just because you had a couple big tough people.
Yeah, you could get a few enforcer politicians in there for that purpose. Yeah, there's more than a few that have military backgrounds. I'm sure you could find some volunteers.
Schwarzenegger could do pretty well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that one of the rules in Congress is that you can't bring a weapon into Congress. Because back in the 1800s, early 1800s, people would get pissed off at each other, and sometimes they'd try to shoot each other. So they passed a rule because that was becoming a problem.
Yep. Only punching.
That didn't stop some guy from beating the ever-loving hell out of another congressman who he thought insulted him with a cane. I think that was a famous event before the American Civil War. It was some Southern guy, I think. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But he took his cane and beat the shit out of this abolitionist politician from the North after a big debate about, I think, slavery or some such in Congress. I want to say Sumner or some such. Yeah, there's been no shortage of violence in the U.S. Congress over the years. They've civilized over time.
Yeah,
it's a bit disruptive to proceedings to have people attacking each other like that.
Well, it's that process of norms changing that we've talked about.
Yeah.
Where it's just less common and it seems more absurd to beat up your opposing politician with a cane. Where at that point, it apparently wasn't too far out of the question.
Yeah, institutions evolve over time, and the evolution of institutional norms in the United States have evolved in a way that somewhat delegitimizes political violence, especially in the hallowed halls of the state, certainly the federal state in Washington. That's probably for the best. That's a good norm, I would imagine.
No. Unless you're the big guy.
Yeah, you're at a bit of a disadvantage then.
So there was one post about a failed U.S. president, like right before the Civil War, who ended up, he was really bad apparently. I think it was Tyler? I'm not sure. But he was a failed president, and he ended up being a representative in the Confederate States, House of Reps or whatever. And he was given the title Overseer of Roads or something because he was so bad and they made him have this position to mock him. But apparently he took it very seriously and he was stopping traffic and stuff to measure the roads. It was a very, very funny scenario.
Yeah, never underestimate the ego of the politician. They will find a way to inflate themselves, no matter how marginal the job is you give them. Yeah, that sounds like something that would have happened in 19th century America. There was a lot of patronage politics back then. Just kind of give people a job just to reward them for their support and whatever other underhanded type stuff they did for you while you were campaigning.
Yeah, or to punish them in this case.
Try to punish them.
That backfired.
Doesn't always work. Probably would have been better just to let him go.
Yeah.
It doesn't look good for your patronage network if you start arbitrarily getting rid of people on a whim. You do have to reward your followers somehow. At least you did at that time. We might be coming back to that. We're not there yet, but we're kind of on that trajectory. We could see something like a patronage network emerging in American politics again in the next 20-some years, maybe. Depending on how society adjusts to the economic churn we're experiencing right now. I think we were talking last week about what does a post-scarcity society look like, and what should it look like, and what does that debate look like, and it could be that there's no good answer, and that there's just sort of a default, the political system to a patronage system in which politicians of one sort or another claim that they're not for universal basic income or mass welfare or some of the other government-based solutions to a post-scarcity scenario where you have a lot of people who need work but can't find it because of automation or what have you. And rather than doing that, though, they might effectively do something like that by taking money from the government and, pork barrel project type things, taking money from the government and spending it in their districts and giving out money that way to their constituents. And if that happens on a broad enough base, then you could see coalitions form of different patronage networks, which would recreate the party machine politics of the late 19th century, early 20th century American political system. And that could be the way that resources are distributed. It's not a particularly healthy way, because it gives a lot of power to the people at the head of those political machines, and they may or may not have the best interest of their constituents or country, for that matter, in mind. Once you have a large patronage network like that and you are dependent on it to maintain your power, it kind of becomes your boss. Maintaining that patronage network takes priority, and you might do things to maintain it that you wouldn't do otherwise. You can kind of see some of that with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, because when he took power, he was kind of a reformer. He wasn't even really supposed to take power. His brother had been groomed for the role, but his brother died in a car accident, I think, in the mid-90s. And so Bashar al-Assad was sort of the third choice. First choice has been his father's brother, but his father's brother tried to stage a coup in the 80s and then was exiled. The coup was unsuccessful. So he was next in line, and he hadn't really been planning on it. I think he was going to medical school or something in Britain at the time. His wife was actually British, I think. Descended from, I think, Syrians or Arabs, I don't remember which, but technically they met and married in Britain, if I'm remembering correctly. And he came back and was nominally kind of for reform, but his hands were kind of tied, because the regime there is basically a family regime. The Assad family is pretty much the top of the pyramid there. And to maintain their hold on power, they have to distribute resources to certain key people in the government and outside government, even key economic elites and what have you. And too much reform that pisses off too many of those people might result not in a reformed, liberalized Syria, but in a coup attempt that basically throws you out and replaces you with someone who is better at managing that patronage network. So to be fair to Bashar al-Assad, which is not something I'll say very much, but to be fair, there's only so much he could do. And when the rebellion happened, that narrowed the scope of his decision-making considerably, because at that point it was pretty much crack down hard and go all in, or give substantial reforms that put your rule at risk. Not only in terms of the instability that reforms caused, but again, because of that potential coup attempt from your patronage network that feels you're not looking after it anymore. So we'll see. Patronage networks are hard to fix once they're installed, so that could be a problem if it happens here in the US, but who knows? That's long term, and as we've discussed before, I think at length, it's very difficult to predict what happens over the long term.
We'll see.
I think there were two things that caught my eye. One was over the past week. One was that North Korea and South Korea are nominally, supposedly, going to negotiate a peace treaty to end the war. Because technically the Korean War never really ended. Technically, South Korea and North Korea are still at war. And so is the UN, for that matter, again, technically. And a peace treaty would be a big step forward, because one of the big reasons the United States is in South Korea in the first place is specifically because the war is unfinished and North Korea could hypothetically attack again at any time. So having a peace treaty in place is not proof positive that the North Korean government is serious about negotiating an end to its nuclear weapons program and potentially something resembling normal relations between North Korea and South Korea, such that the United States does not feel, or for that matter, South Korea doesn't feel, that it needs American troops on the peninsula. But it is one of the signs that you would look for. That is one of the preconditions one would expect if North Korea were serious. And I think a couple of the other signals was, one, that North Korea hasn't been testing its nukes or its ballistic missiles over the past couple weeks. And that's another positive sign. That would be another precondition. I think they even came out this past week and officially declared that they're going to stop doing the test and that they're going to dismantle one of the test sites. Again, that's not proof positive that this is going to go anywhere. This current peace process, if you want to call it that, is going to go anywhere, but it is one of the preconditions. And then I think there was the other one that I read this past week was that in North Korea there's been a shift in tone. Normally the North Korean media is very militant, very aggressive, not only towards foreigners, but just in general. Sort of the predominant theme in North Korea's media is very much the military, the regime, the ruler, etc. And apparently over the past month or so they've toned that down considerably and shifted more towards the arts, young people, portraying Kim Jong-un as a family man, things like that, things that are very different than the previous tone. And again, that's not a substantive change, but it's part of a pattern. Again, these are three different things, three different signs that are encouraging if you're hoping for a positive outcome on the peninsula. So potentially, there could be some traction there. Certainly that would be a very positive outcome, given that people had been worried that the United States might unilaterally strike North Korea, and that there could be some misunderstandings that resulted in a general conflict on the peninsula again.
My initial reaction to that is there must be some motivator for this change in tone. Like, I kind of doubt that it would just be random of, oh, let's play nice. We've been the Hermit Kingdom for decades now. It's time for change. Like, that seems very random to me. It seems kind of like there's probably some motivator. Some people have asked if the way the US has been talking about North Korea threatens them. Like we've been saying, it's kind of just the talking game, right? Where they want to look really strong and stuff and say a whole bunch, but it doesn't necessarily mean too much. The flip side is their economy has been really weak for a really long time, and it's possible that they cripple themselves to the point where they need to look at other options and stuff. So that's kind of what I would guess if I had to guess about why they would be buddy-buddy with other countries and start to appear more open.
I doubt it would be the economy, because the economy in North Korea actually was way worse in the 90s. There was a mass famine for a number of years in the 90s, and the regime didn't liberalize then. And if they're not going to liberalize when millions of people are starving, and probably, we don't know how many people died, but it was probably quite a few. If they didn't liberalize then, I doubt they would do it now when the North Korean economy is, by all accounts, doing much better. It's not great, and it's still probably not even good, but it's a hell of a lot better than in the 90s. There's more scope for free markets. There are some rudimentary free markets tacitly allowed at a localized level in North Korea. The regime isn't particularly open about it, and I don't think they're even technically legal, but it's one of those discreetly done, discreetly ignored type of arrangements, basically. And I think the government recognizes the need for such markets in order to facilitate the distribution of goods that previously were not percolating to the people throughout the population, throughout the market, like they needed to, in order to prevent shortages of one sort or another. So they're doing pretty decent on that count. I think a more important motivator is probably, like you mentioned, the Trump administration, which has taken a very hard line, perhaps somewhat irrationally so, appearing somewhat irrational in the process. And, that pressure from probably Trump himself, more so than the administration generally, caused enough consternation with the North Korean government that they were willing to move in a different direction. I might add here that it was probably not just Trump administration. It was probably a combination of the Trump administration's pressure combined with reluctance on the part of China to really fully back them. China doesn't want North Korea to have a nuclear weapon or a nuclear weapons program. And so when the United States started piling on the pressure, North Korea turned to its ally and asked them if they would back them, and Beijing probably said, yes, but you can't have the nukes program if you want our support. So that's going to be a precondition. So between the hammer and the anvil, the North Korean regime probably didn't feel it had any real significant options that would include them maintaining their current nuclear program, as it has been up until now. There had been some speculation that they might try to make a big push for a nuclear weapon anyway, even with both China and the United States pressuring them to drop it. But the past week or two has suggested that it would seem that Kim Jong-un doesn't want to do that. It would seem that that cost would be too high. They may be able to pull it off, but with sanctions continuing to escalate and the United States ambiguously threatening some kind of possible unilateral action, and with China not really giving much of a shit if the United States does that, that really puts Pyongyang in a bind. So it may be that Pyongyang figures, yeah, we could make a big move towards a nuke, but it would be inordinately costly. Let's trade the nuclear weapons program for something resembling normal relations. And Kim Jong-un will stay in power. I mean, I don't think there will be any substantive political change in North Korea as part of the negotiation. It will be narrowly focused specifically on the nuclear weapons program and changing the overall security environment on the peninsula in a way that, one, North Korea feels comfortable enough giving up its nuclear weapons program, and two, probably also that the United States and South Korea feel comfortable with a mitigation, if not withdrawal, of America's military presence on the peninsula, since that's likely to be the concession that the North Koreans ask for. They'll say, we'll give up, they're going to offer to give up the nuclear weapons program, but they're going to want something in return, and I'll wager that it's going to be some kind of drawdown, potentially a long-term drawdown. It might be like over the next 5 to 10 years, U.S. forces will draw down slowly, and the U.S. will probably relocate them to Okinawa or some other base sort of in the region, but not on the peninsula. And that would suit China just fine, because of course China over the past year or two has been complaining a lot about the deployment of the THAAD missile system, this Theater High Altitude Air Defense missile system designed to shoot down ballistic missiles. And the radar system that corresponds with the THAAD missile system can see far into China, and apparently Beijing doesn't like that. So they want those sites gone, and hypothetically they could get that if this negotiation happens the way it's kind of trending towards. But again, all of this is pure speculation. It may be that Pyongyang is just playing for time and that they're going to have a surprise later. They maybe find some excuse to walk away from the talks and make a big push again for the nuclear weapons program. Probably again for the ballistic missiles specifically, if not also for the nuclear weapons themselves in terms of miniaturization, which is the necessary next step if you're going to have nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, which they don't yet have. Well, China would like that rather less, but again, if North Korea can find an excuse to walk away from the talks, they might be able to convince China that the talks aren't going anywhere, that the United States is making unreasonable demands, and that they should get more backing from China. Yeah. Sorry, you were about to say something.
Well, just to kind of interpret what you're saying in a condensed format, it's more so that by them giving up the nukes for a more kind of friendly approach, they have more to gain. Whereas by having the nukes, it's more of a threat against people fucking with them, but no one's really actively messing with North Korea in a military capacity. It's like threats and sanctions. It's more in just the landscape of how the economies and the trade relates, as opposed to getting a weapon to put them on par. Like, what are they going to gain from that? It's more of like protection against something bad happening, whereas if they choose not to push the nuke route, then there are opportunities with support from China, like you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the North Koreans are not so much pushing for the removal of America's presence on the peninsula, so much as they are asking for something resembling a Chinese security guarantee. Mm-hmm. That's probably going to be a condition in the background that we don't see. While Kim Jong-un is negotiating with Donald Trump, it's going to center around the American military presence and the North Korean nuclear program, I would predict anyway. But in the background behind that is going to be a tacit Chinese guarantee of North Korea's security if the talks progress in a way that results in either the North Koreans giving up their nuclear weapons program, or if the talks collapse in a way that meets certain conditions, basically. If the Chinese believe that the United States is not making an honest effort, is not negotiating in good faith, they might then be willing to give the North Koreans more room to maneuver, some more rope, basically, in terms of their nuclear weapons program. They'll probably still pressure them to drop it in that case, but there would be more support in terms of, say, resisting a unilateral American action or some such equivalent.
Cool. Well, a little bit of light has been shed.
So that was one of the principal probably the principal news item that kind of caught my eye. The other one was Armenia, which is having some mass protests right now because their president is trying to pull a Putin, so to speak. The political system in Armenia had been a presidential system, and the president there, and I forgot to write down his name, so I don't quite recall it, but this guy has been president for 2 terms. And in his second term, he pushed for a change in the political system to a parliamentary system. And if you know your political systems, you know that in a parliamentary system, the prime minister is the most powerful position in government, as opposed to the president, who's the most powerful in a presidential political system. So he orchestrated a change in government with his supporters to a parliamentary system. And when he did so, he promised, I'm totally not doing this so that I could be prime minister and stay on for effectively a 3rd term. So what did he do? He declared himself prime minister. Well, he didn't declare himself prime minister. He had his party, which is the dominant political party in Armenia, vote him prime minister. I think it was last week or the week before that. And the opposition did not particularly like that, and so for the past week or so, there's been mass protests against his rule, demanding basically that he resign, step down. He did meet with the opposition leader, I think, yesterday or so, but he apparently thought it was going to be more of a negotiation. It was going to be more about, all right, you want something, I'll give it to you in exchange for toning down the protest or winding down the protest. And instead, the opposition leader really pushed for his resignation. Like, we don't need you in power. We want you to step down so that somebody else can come in. And it would probably be somebody from his party, so it's no substantive change. It's just this guy specifically standing down that the opposition wants. Well, the president come prime minister didn't like that, so he walked out of the talks after a couple of minutes. They were not prolonged negotiation. And after that, the opposition leader and a number of other opposition leaders were arrested. And so right now, there's no nominal leadership to the protest movement, but it has legs. There's a lot of people out, and so for now, the pressure is being maintained. Whether or not it goes anywhere is kind of ambiguous. I don't know enough about Armenian politics and the circumstances involved to really make an accurate prediction there. But I just thought it was interesting because Armenia is a Russian ally. You know, they're a part of CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. I think that's what it's called, which is sort of Russia's equivalent to NATO. It's a collective defense organization that includes a couple countries in the what the Russians like to call their near abroad, quote unquote. And Armenia is a treaty signatory. And as a Russian ally, I'm a little curious what the Russian media and Russian government kind of think of the protests, because normally when protests like these happen in a Russian allied or aligned state, the Russian government pitches a fit and accuses the West of, orchestrating mass protest, a color revolution, these kinds of things. So I'm kind of wondering how they're painting it. Maybe there are some Russians in chat who can kind of illuminate that for me. But yeah, I thought it's an interesting case study in what it looks like for a country in Russia's sphere of influence to experience civil unrest. Well, I think we did have some questions, so I guess I'll take a look at some of these. Let's see, with Paul Manafort back in the news, it's a little unclear who he is to a non-American. Who is he? What did he do? Why is he in the news as a quote-unquote Russian back channel? And what exactly does that imply/mean? Paul Manafort was a employee in the Trump election campaign in 2016. Which is how he became a person of interest, during the Mueller investigation into possible Russian election meddling in the 2016 election, and into any possible conspiracy or coordination between individuals in the Trump campaign and individuals connected to the Russian government or other Russian actors. Paul Manafort, being in the campaign, was investigated, and it was found that he did have some connections to Russia that he had not previously disclosed. And I don't know the details exactly, but apparently he did break a few laws because of that failure to disclose those connections. I think specifically he had failed to disclose that he had previously worked or at least been paid as a consultant, I think, by the Yanukovych government in the Ukraine. And if you don't remember Yanukovych, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, so I apologize for that. But Yanukovych was the previous prime minister of the Ukraine before the Maidan revolution, or Maidan protest, or whatever you want to call that. And he was very, well, maybe he wasn't very pro-Russian, but he was aligned more with Russia than he was with the West. He was popularly perceived as being quote-unquote pro-Russia in the Ukraine. And Paul Manafort did some consulting work for him, which he failed to disclose at some point. I don't know, again, the details, but his failure to disclose that information apparently is what got him into trouble, along with some money laundering charges, apparently. So the issue there is not so much that Paul Manafort is a Russian agent and he was acting as the conduit for Russia into the Trump campaign, more so that he had some connections with Russia that he illegally failed to disclose, and that's what's more got him into hot water. How significant that is, whether or not that's, you know, a sort of where there's smoke there's fire situation, whether that he is just the tip of an iceberg that maybe we haven't seen yet, I don't know. The investigation is still ongoing. I'm not really following it that closely because I have very low expectations for the investigation. I expect the Mueller investigation to basically run the same course that the Hillary Clinton emails investigation ran, which is pretty much to spend a lot of time and effort investigating something for which there's very little information on which you could really make a judgment one way or the other. And ultimately, in a circumstance like that, investigators will probably defer, will probably not press charges. They'll probably defer on that. That's my expectation, and because of that expectation, I'm not paying as much attention to the whole Mueller investigation as some other people. And as a result, I can't give too much of a detailed answer here to this question like this person might want. So I apologize. That isn't maybe the most satisfying answer. But basically, that's Paul Manafort in a nutshell, at least as I understand it. I don't think the charges brought against him is really that significant as far as implicating the Trump campaign, which is what's under investigation, if not also Trump himself. But there is potential that it could evolve into something more depending on what information is uncovered by further investigation into Paul Manafort and his ties to the campaign, and what ties he may have had to certain other actors who may have been trying to influence the election, if any.
I think it's like watching NASCAR, where maybe it just kind of goes around, but there could be a crash and cars could flip around, and that would be very exciting. So yeah. It's kind of like that, where you kind of expect the cars to just go round and round, but there are a bunch of people just hoping it's just going to all go to shit.
Yeah, it's a pretty astute analogy. That probably pretty well summarizes the interest of a lot of people in the investigation thus far. They're hoping for something dramatic.
Oh, there goes a tire. Come on.
Yeah, whenever you have a big investigation like this, and, you know, the Clinton administration way back in the 90s, the Monica Lewinsky investigation was kind of another example of this. When you have a big investigation, you can always find leads. There's a lot of different things that you can kind of discover in the process of the investigation. And so they tend to be very drawn out, especially when there's not a lot of evidence to kind of go on. You know, if there's not enough evidence to really go on with which to make a judgment, you kind of just keep going and you keep trying to find it. You keep following more and more leads, and you go down more and more rabbit holes, and then you find more and more information that you might not have found otherwise. You know, so a lot of the things going on in the Trump campaign that have proven to be illegal are not really explicitly illegal, at least frequently. They're more things that have happened either probably just absent-mindedly or just not necessarily conspiracy to commit crimes, more just, you know, unfamiliarity with the law or accidents or what have you. Maybe there was some conspiracy, maybe there was some malign attempt, I don't know.
Yeah, but what just kind of illegal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's given how complex a lot of campaign laws are, especially at the national level. It's I mean, it's almost inevitable that somebody is going to do something illegal in a large campaign. Ideally, you have enough organization and enough expertise to minimize that. But if you have a big, thorough investigation into a large campaign, I would suspect almost any such investigation into any such large campaign would find some kind of wrongdoing somewhere by someone. So it's no surprise that the Mueller investigation is finding some illegality occurring in the Trump campaign. If you had a similar such investigation into the Clinton campaign, you probably would have found a few similar such examples. You may not have found as many, and they may not have been as goofy or amateurish as some of what we've seen from the Trump campaign, but they probably would have still been there. So, given that's my perspective, I'm still a little skeptical that the Mueller investigation is going to go anywhere significant. But like you say, you know, people are hopeful. They're hopeful that they find something, and that they have something against the Trump administration that they can use. We'll see. Whatever the Mueller investigation finds, if Trump fires Mueller first, that just gives a lot of ammunition to his political rivals, and there's no need to do that. You know, in a way, the Russia investigation is the most effective tool that has been yet devised against Donald Trump, as far as political weapons go. Because in general, you know, as I just said, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. So really, the smart thing to do would just to be quiet about it and just try to minimize it. But Trump's ego seems to be just so big that he can't let it go, and it keeps getting him in trouble. And you know, if he fires Mueller, then that's going to be a big victory for the whole, whoever it was, whatever quarter decided that it was a good idea to start the investigation, perhaps for political reasons. That would be a big win for them. And it would just purely be down in that case to Trump's inability to kind of restrain himself. I'm sure his advisors tell him every day, relax, don't do it, don't fire him, just let it go. Just let it run its course. But it really seems like he can't do that. He just seems to have an instinct to try to protect his image, and he just can't let it go. We'll see what happens there. I think if there's a big blow-up, it'll be more from that than anything the investigation itself finds. Let's see, what is your current take on the situation in Turkey regarding Erdogan? Do you believe he will attack Greece? Yeah, this story is based off of an island dispute. Well, not even an island dispute, an islet dispute, in which people, what was it? Some tiny island, basically, that Turkey and Greece have kind of gone back and forth on, but nobody really cares about. There was some guy or some guys planted a Greek flag on one of the islets, and so it turned into a thing, basically. And so then there's kind of been a lot of rhetoric back and forth about it. But I don't think there's a lot of substance to it. You know, Turkey has elections coming up, and Erdogan is going to try to cement his power in those elections. You know, if you've been paying attention to Turkish politics, you know that last year there was a referendum on changing Turkey's political system to a, what was it, a presidential system. Kind of, again, this is kind of a retread of the Armenia story I just told. It's been a parliamentary system, basically, up until now. But Erdogan specifically, wants to be president. So he pushed a referendum to change it to a presidential system, and now he's going to be president, basically, if he wins the election. And I think he even moved the election date up recently. I think it was going to be like in November or something, and he moved the election date up to June this past week. I think I had some notes on that, too. Yeah, and I think the suspicion is that he wants to have the elections under emergency rule, because right now Turkey is under emergency rule, technically. The government has emergency powers, let's put it like that. And it may be that Erdogan wants to have the elections under those conditions, because that would give him more scope to attack political rivals with those emergency powers, which he would not be able to do, presumably, if the elections were held in November after the emergency powers are set to sunset. Also, there's a big nationalist wave in Turkey right now because of the Afrin operation against the Kurds in Syria. So everybody is very excited about that. And that's kind of given Erdogan a kind of bump in his popularity, and he may want to try to exploit that by having the election sooner. That bump may fade with time, you know, by November. So that may also be a factor. But in general, I think the whole Greek issue is more part of that. You know, I think it's part of his Erdogan's election calculus. If he can trump up nationalist sentiment in Turkey by having some kind of confrontation with Greece, then that only helps him. You know, that kind of helps his improve his credentials as a Turkish nationalist, which is, you know, kind of a big deal, because he already has the support of all of the sort of pro-business / socially conservative Turks in Turkey. That's kind of his core constituency, but he seems to be trying to build a coalition that includes at least some Turkish nationalists who are traditionally a little more secular and more aligned with the Ataturk tradition in Turkish politics, which he's kind of seen as being at odds with, since he's seen as being more of an Islamist type political figure. And I think he even announced over the past week of the formation of a coalition with the MHP, which is a bit mind-boggling, given that the MHP is a thoroughly ultranationalist political organization in Turkey. There was a sufficient upset about it within the MHP's ranks that a significant figure in the MHP basically left the party and took a good chunk of it with her to form a splinter party that is dead set opposed to Erdogan. But that's the formation of that coalition with the MHP kind of shows that he's trying to kind of appeal to nationalists a bit, and the operation against Afrin and the tensions with Greece, I think, are a part of that. But I don't think he wants a war with Greece. I think he's just issuing a lot of rhetoric so he can appeal to people and win votes. Maybe if there was like a minor struggle over the islets in question, that would work. You know, he might gamble with that, but I don't think he would see it as worth it. And there's not really anything to fight over because Turkey pretty much controls the islets in question. They're not big islands. Again, they're not even islands. Islets are just very tiny. They're basically large rocks in the Aegean Sea. So I don't think anybody's going to see them as worth fighting for in the first place. You know,
maybe
somebody
they're pretty
planting.
awesome rocks, though, dude.
I don't know. I saw some pictures. They look pretty bland to me. They're pretty laissez-faire rocks in the ocean as far as rocks go. I think there's probably not going to be any violence over them. There might be some posturing and whatnot, some rhetoric, but beyond that, it's not going to go anywhere. I really think it's just election politics on the part of Turkey, and the Turkish president specifically, Erdogan.
Just symbolic rocks. It's not about the rocks themselves, it's about the principle of the thing.
It's the principle of who owns these rocks. By God, these are Turkish rocks, not Greek rocks.
Look at them. Don't they even look Turkish?
Exactly. And if you believe so too, you should vote for Erdogan.
Right.
Exactly. I think to kind of follow on with that, the splinter party from the MHP is led by a woman whose name is, I think, what was it? Aster Mansour? Something to that effect. I don't remember exactly. But she kind of got well known during the referendum debate, because in the lead up to the referendum over whether to shift Turkey's political system to a presidential model, she was a principal voice in the MHP against that proposal, basically for a no vote. And she actually went against the party leadership doing that, because back then the MHP and the AKP, Erdogan's party, were both kind of negotiating and had a nominal coalition in place regarding that change. But she was kind of the voice for the opposition in the MHP to that arrangement, and she's been vocal ever since, and now basically has her own party. So there is some hope that in the elections to come, in June, I think, that maybe she and her group will do well, and will act as the kind of leader, de facto leader of the opposition. That may or may not happen. The opposition in Turkey is thoroughly divided. There's just so many different actors with very different beliefs that it's hard to envision them really kind of reconciling and coming together over it. You know, there's left-wingers, there's socialists, there's ultra-nationalists, nationalists, and not a lot in between. You know, those are pretty disparate groups. So it's a hard sell that they'll all kind of come together just to defeat Erdogan. They haven't been able to do it for over the past 10, 15 years. I don't know that there's conditions have sufficiently changed that they'll be able to pull it off this time. So probably the most likely outcome is that Erdogan and the AKP win the elections, and he becomes president, and he has new power basically in Turkey, even greater power. And who's to say what he'll do with it? That's unclear. I think one of the big questions at this point is not so much whether Erdogan becomes president and becomes newly empowered in Turkey. The question is, will the military do anything about it? And the Turkish military, if you're familiar with Turkey, has been rather active in Turkish politics over the past half-century or so. It's certainly been one of the leading political institutions. They were effectively the authoritarian government for much of the 20th century, before allowing more scope for democratic political activity starting roughly in the 90s and on until now. It was that new scope that they gave in which Erdogan and the AKP were able to kind of emerge from and gain power. So the big question now is, to what degree has the AKP neutered the Turkish military and its political power? To what degree is the Turkish military loyal to the state, and by extension, Erdogan and the AKP? Or, in contrast, to what extent is the Turkish military still autonomous? And if they are still autonomous, would they use that autonomy to try to overthrow the government again? You kind of saw a little bit of that with the coup attempt a year or two ago. But the Turkish military didn't really seem to be behind that. That seemed to be a pretty small cohort within the military. There was a suspicion, I think, among a lot of people that it was actually Gulenists who were behind it. And the Turkish military doesn't like Gulenists.
We've talked about them before.
Yeah. Gulen is kind of this Islamist figure in Turkey who leads a sort of, not like a cult, not a sect per se, but he leads a kind of religious school of thought. And it's nominally Islamist, but it's also kind of relatively secular and kind of emphasizes modernity and education and self-improvement and things like that. And they have a huge presence in, well, had anyway, a huge presence in Turkey's education system. There was a lot of private schools that were basically run by this institution. And a lot of their people ended up in positions of power in government, in the bureaucracy, in the military, etc. And they, for a long time, they had an alliance with Erdogan and the AKP. And Erdogan and the AKP used the Gulenists in the government to try to reduce the power of the military. There was a lot of famous, famous in Turkey anyway, court cases in which a lot of military, ultranationalists in the military were arrested. Can't quite remember their faction's name, but they were arrested for plotting a coup or considering plotting a coup or some such. And the evidence that was used to convict them came from secret recordings that were made by people who are suspected now to have been Gulenists, informing basically on these people on behalf of the government. And that worked for a long time in terms of curbing the power of the military and empowering the AKP and democratic institutions, but eventually the Gulenists and Erdogan fell out with each other, and the Gulenists turned on him, started releasing secret recordings of him, including a famous one in which he's discussing laundering money with his son, if I recall correctly. And that led to a significant breakdown in relations between those two groups. And so, starting, I think a couple years ago, basically Erdogan switched partners. He turned on the Gulenists, and he started a kind of détente with the military. And so there's a sort of concordant, a kind of understanding between the AKP and the Turkish military, such that they haven't really gone after each other much. The focus is more of a combined emphasis on minimizing the presence of Gulenists in Turkey's institutions. Now, whether or not that's resulted in a circumstance where democratic institutions are paramount and the Turkish military is subservient to them and would not do anything even if Erdogan made a big push to concentrate power in his hands, and perhaps even becoming a de facto despot at some point. Or maybe the concordant is such that the Turkish military largely retains its power and does hypothetically retain the power to overthrow the government if it wanted to. So the upcoming elections in which Erdogan will have unprecedented power, if he wins, which he likely will, I think that'll be a significant test case. It won't be proof positive if the Turkish military doesn't do anything that they can't do anything, but that would be a significant signal, I think, that the military has largely been tamed, I would expect. So something to watch, basically. It'll be a significant milestone, one way or the other. Let's see. Lawmakers in the U.S. are trying to push through legislation that will limit the U.S. involvement in the conflict in Yemen. Why did Saudi Arabia fail to quickly end the conflict, and what, if any, would be a political solution to the war in Yemen? And then a related question, can you give us a summary of the Yemen civil war? Okay. So the question is, why did Saudi Arabia fail to quickly end the conflict? I mean, there was no kind of end game for the Saudis. I mean, when they jumped in, they didn't really have a plan. I think they just wanted to get in so they could send a signal to Iran that the Saudis are willing to protect their interests in the region, their perceived interests anyway. I mean, the criticism of the Saudi involvement in the Yemeni civil war is that there's no real Saudi interest in the conflict. Like, nominally, there's been tensions between the Saudi government and the Houthis even before the Houthis became a significant political political actor in Yemen, but it's not really thought that that tension is sufficient to really warrant the degree of Saudi involvement in the conflict as it's become. I guess I should answer the second part of the question first. What is the Yemeni civil war? So the Yemeni civil war kind of stems from the Arab Spring. Before the Arab Spring, Yemen had been ruled by a dictator named Saleh, and he had ruled Yemen for, I want to say, like 20, 25 years or something like that. He had been around a long time. But he was facing more and more problems in Yemen, because in Yemen, the biggest part of the economy had been oil, and that's saying something about how poor Yemen is, because Yemen never really had a whole lot of oil. You know, so that being their principal source of revenue, and not being a large source of revenue, and a failing source of revenue, because the oil started running out, I think, in the 90s or so, and government revenues started to kind of tail off. And Saleh's power was dependent on a patronage network that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. It became increasingly difficult to maintain that patronage network with the falling government revenues. And falling government revenues also corresponded with falling government services. You know, education got worse, services in urban areas got worse, the economy started to get worse. Not so much because of the falling government. The economy did worse, not just because the government revenue fell, but also because just the oil industry had been a big part of it, and that declined. And there wasn't really anything to kind of replace it. And there was kind of ongoing political tensions, too, stemming from unification. Before 1994, I want to say, Yemen had actually been two separate countries, North Yemen and South Yemen. And South Yemen had kind of been okay with unification, creating a unified Yemen in 94, but they quickly soured on it because, you know, the new government was very corrupt. It was dominated by people from the, I want to say, specifically Saleh, I guess. I may be missing, I'm probably missing some important details there. It's been a while since I've read about this, but basically people in the south soured on the unified Yemen, and there was tensions, and there's been nominally a separatist movement there that has kind of waxed and waned with time. Sometimes it's very active, sometimes not so much. But it's since the Arab Spring, it's definitely been in an active phase. But regardless, those tensions contributed to overarching tensions and economic difficulties and whatnot in Yemen leading up to the Arab Spring. And dissatisfaction with Saleh, stemming from those factors, basically had an outlet with the Arab Spring. That was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And that led to mass protests in Yemen against Saleh that resulted in a lot of violence and tensions, but not a civil war. It was a mass protest movement, but it didn't result in Saleh in mass conflict between different factions. That happened later. And what happened was Saleh ended up almost being assassinated. There was an assassination attempt that did blow him up, but he didn't die. He was medevaced out to Saudi Arabia, and they were actually to save his life. But he was eventually pushed out of power. His people kind of abandoned. His faction was still nominally loyal, but his larger patronage network turned on him. And eventually, basically, the part of the Yemeni military not loyal to Saleh, in conjunction with different political factions in the protest movement, united to form a new government and to push Saleh out. And that was the Hadi government. Hadi was a general in the Yemeni military, became the new president of Yemen following the overthrow of the Saleh government. And for a while, it was looking like Yemen would enter a period of reform, led by the Hadi government. But the Hadi government was not really able to pull it off. There was just too many conflicting interests. The Hadi government had no solution to the country's economic problems, so the economy continued to deteriorate. And there was a big blow-up over the design of districts. They had a electoral system that required the design of voting districts, and some districts were designed in a way that seemed to marginalize certain groups. You know, this kind of harkens back to the conversation we had last week about the difficulty with designing electoral districts in a way that doesn't piss off one group or another, such that you can have something resembling a universally accepted system that is not thought by somebody somewhere to constitute gerrymandering. So that tension, the economic tension, the political tension from the districts, and political tension between different groups within Yemen resulted in another protest movement, this one against the Hadi government. And that opened the door to the Houthis. Now, who are the Houthis? So the Houthis are a Shia sect, that is Shia Islam, Shia Islamic sect in northern Yemen. And they're sort of an odd, isolated group of, an odd, isolated sect. You know, there's not really anybody else that in the Middle East that kind of believes in Shia Islam the way they do. It's kind of isolated, similar to some of the isolated sects, like the one in Syria, like, what was it? Alawites, kind of similar to the Alawites in some ways. And they've been pretty powerful in North Yemen. You know, North Yemen had been a sultanate, I think, for a while, up until the mid-late 20th century. And the sultanate had been of that faith. And eventually they were overthrown by, I think, a pan-Arab nationalist government, if I'm remembering correctly. A pan-Arab nationalists in the Yemeni, North Yemeni military, if I'm remembering correctly. And they've been kind of marginalized ever since. But they're a coherent bloc within the northern part of northern Yemen. So geographically, they're very concentrated, which means that in their little nook of Yemen, they're very powerful. And for a long time, they've had, you know, tensions with the Yemeni government. The Yemeni government didn't really think they were worth messing with, so they kind of let them do their own thing. They also had tensions with the Saudi government. There were some cross-border raids, basically. And the Saudis responded with, you know, airstrikes, what have you. And I think there were 2 or 3 de facto wars, minor wars, if you will, between the Saudi government and the Houthis in northern Yemen. Again, relating to kind of smuggling, cross-border raids, what have you. So there's long-standing tensions between the Houthis and the Saudis on that count. But they'd been pretty isolated up until the Arab Spring. And after the Arab Spring, they started getting a lot more autonomy as the authority of the government receded. And the Houthis became more and more powerful, not only in their province, but in surrounding provinces. Part of that was the spread of Houthi militias. Part of it also was popular acceptance, because they were seen as less corrupt than the Hadi government and certain other establishment political factions in Yemen. So based off of that support, they started building larger and larger militias and started spreading out from their traditional stronghold in the north. And eventually they spread to the capital, Sana'a, whereupon they basically threw out the Hadi government and created a new government that was a coalition of various different factions, but which they were kind of first among equals, if you will. Effectively, it's a Houthi government, but it's nominally an inclusive one. They do at least have symbolic representation for the other groups, even if it's not necessarily substantive. I'm not familiar enough with the government they created to really make a judgment there. I'd have to read a lot more about it. But basically, the Hadi government cried foul. They said that the government had been overthrown in a coup and that the Houthis were illegitimate rulers, and the Hadi government, as a result, asked for help. And it was at that point that the civil war kind of got started in earnest. Basically, the Hadi government and its people fighting against the Houthis. Now, one of the big things that really got the Houthis going was not just their popularity. It was also the fact that they made an alliance of convenience with Saleh. Saleh still had a lot of loyal people loyal to him in the Yemeni government, including in the Yemeni military. And so Saleh used his leverage and his patronage network to ally that part of the Yemeni military which was loyal to him with the Houthi militias to create a combined force that was stronger than the part of the Yemeni military loyal to the Hadi government. So the Houthis and Saleh together were able to basically conquer big chunks of Yemen. And that's how the Hadi government was overthrown and marginalized. Now the Hadi government still has territory in the south, in particular along the coast. And they still have a good chunk of the military fighting for them. They also have a nominal alliance with the separatists, although that's touch and go. Southern separatists would be just as happy to see southern Yemen declare independence and basically end the civil war that way. You know, the Houthis could have Sana'a, North Yemen, and then the separatists in Aden. Aden is the biggest city in, I think, Yemen, certainly South Yemen, I think. And then the Adeni separatists in South Yemen would have their own country, and then the Hadi government could just sort of buzz off. You know, they would just be left with nothing, basically. But for now, the separatists are not really powerful enough to make that happen. And so they're nominally, at least, fighting to defend their territory from the Houthi-Saleh alliance. They're not really, I think, really engaged in offensive actions like the Hadi government forces are. So at this point, the civil war is going on. Salah and the Houthis are fighting the Hadi government and the southern separatists. And it's a little unclear the degree to which Iran was involved in this. The Saudis say that the Iranians were supporting the Houthi rebels, the Houthi forces, whatever you want to call them. And predicated on that assertion, the Saudis intervened in the conflict on the side of the Hadi government. And that's how they got involved. They're supposedly countering Iranian influence in Yemen. That's what they say. Now, the criticism is that there was never a lot of evidence to substantiate that. There was some evidence after the fact, but the suspicion is that the Iranians are just getting involved because the Saudis are there. So, you know, chicken and egg argument, were the Iranians involved in some way justifying Saudi action, or did the Saudis just want to get involved for another reason, and then the Iranians came in after the fact to kind of counter their rival in Yemen? Depends on who you talk to. There's evidence both ways. I won't tell you what to believe. You know, you kind of have to make that judgment for yourself. But it's ambiguous. That's my point. That is a point of ambiguity, and it's difficult to judge. Now, if I had to guess, I would say that probably the Saudis were not as interested. We're not completely sure. I would judge that the Saudis were not completely sure that the Iranians were helping the Houthis, but that they thought that even if they weren't, it would be a good opportunity to signal to Iran that the Saudis were serious about defending their interest in the region, serious about projecting that they were willing to project force in the region to defend those interests, and that they were serious about containing Iran in the region. Those are all big signals to send, and the Saudis are kind of already sending some of those signals just by being involved in Syria. But I think the Saudi government, especially under Mohammed bin Salman's influence, well, that's a whole nother conversation, but he's kind of a young guy who's very forward. He wants Saudi Arabia to be much stronger in the region economically and as a political force. So it may be that under bin Salman, the Saudis decided to take a very hawkish line, in which even if it's just ambiguous that the Iranians are involved in Yemen, it's still worth it to get involved in order to send those strong signals to their rival. So in that sense, if that's the case, Saudi involvement in Yemen is not really about wanting to really influence the outcome of the conflict itself. They don't really care about Yemen that much. It's more about Iran and signaling to Iran that they're willing to take action against them, even if Iranian influence is ambiguous. You know, that's kind of has parallels with Vietnam, where the United States didn't really know completely the degree to which the North Vietnamese had connections with the Soviets, but suspicion was enough. And the desire, you know, the fact that suspicion was enough reflected the strong desire to send strong signals to the Soviets that subterfuge and subversion and expansion via subversion and subterfuge would not be tolerated, that there would be a strong line taken even if there was even the remotest suspicion that they were doing that. That obviously got the US in some trouble in Vietnam, and it's getting the Saudis into trouble in Yemen, because it's not really clear how they can extricate themselves from the conflict. There is no real peace in sight, and there's no real clear exit criteria. There's no clear point at which, no real metrics that the Saudis could point to and say, okay, this is the point at which we'll leave. This is the point at which we can declare victory. It's a very ambiguous war that is being done more for political reasons than for practical national security reasons. And that's sort of the problem that the Saudis face. I might also add here in explaining the Yemeni civil war that there's actually a third faction, which is sort of the radical Islamists. That's sort of the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamists operating in the east of the country. The east of the country, though, is mostly desert. It's very sparsely populated, so that's not really a very important front. But when you hear about American drone strikes in Yemen or something to that effect, generally that's where that's happening. The West is more interested in fighting extremists in eastern Yemen, where those factions have power, than it is with influencing the course of the conflict in the west of the country, between the larger, more powerful factions fighting each other. And there's not really much overlap there between the two conflicts either. You know, the Islamists are not that powerful, and they're not really pushing hard against the rest of Yemen and the other factions. So mostly the fighting there is between Western special forces and airstrikes, and the odd Islamist militia here and there. And I don't even know how powerful they still are, because it's operations to kind of degrade them have been going on for a while, and I haven't really been reading up on that. But it's not really that relevant to the course of the overarching conflict between the Hadi government and the Houthis. The recent development, as far as the civil war goes, beyond Saudi involvement, the reasons why, is Salah basically signaling to the Saudis that he would be willing to negotiate. And the thinking was that he might have been trying to form a new coalition in which he flips sides and joins the Saudi allied Hadi government in turning on the Houthis and kicking them out of the capital, Sana'a, and restoring the Hadi government's authority. Certainly the Saudis would be pleased with that because, you know, beyond just signaling to Iran that they're serious about containing their influence, I don't think the Saudi government wants the Houthis in power in general. I don't think that they would I don't think the Saudis would be willing to intervene to the degree they have just to contain the Houthis, which is why, again, I think it's more about Iran. But a secondary objective for the Saudis is kind of containing Houthi influence in Yemen, and getting Saleh to switch sides would serve that. And so there was some thinking that he was trying to arrange such a coup, basically a diplomatic shift, but he wasn't able to pull it off because the Houthis got wind of it and basically killed him. They surrounded his compound in Sana'a and assassinated him. And it's not really clear what's happened to his faction since then. I think nominally they're still fighting with the Houthis. I haven't heard anything to the contrary on that. But it hasn't really led to a significant change in the conflict's direction. It still seems like there's a de facto stalemate between the Houthis and the Hadi government. So Saleh is no longer a significant player. His faction might be, but without having read more about what they've been doing since Saleh's assassination, I can't really judge that. I would have to brush up on my Yemen civil war to do that. But roughly, that's where things stand right now. That's the Yemen civil war in a nutshell. And I think that pretty well covered the question. Summary of the Yemen civil war. We got that. Why did Saudi Arabia fail to quickly end the conflict? Yeah, we pretty much covered that. There's just no, again, it's a political war in the Vietnam style, so there's not really any natural end point. You know, the Saudis have good air power, but not a lot of ground power, and even if they did, probably wouldn't make much difference. There's just too much churn, there are too many factions, there's too much internal politics to really have a clear-cut victory one way or the other. So probably the conflict will just drag out. I might add that the Saudis are going to keep fighting there regardless of what the US does. You know, the US can put pressure on them or, you know, not cooperate with them, but it's not going to matter. Yeah, they'll find their weapons someplace else if they have to. You know, for the Saudi government, it's a matter of national security. And countries can be very irrational about national security. That's no stretch. Certainly plenty of examples here in the United States even. So I don't think it'll make a lot of difference. You know, it might make some people feel better, but mostly it'll just reduce the US leverage over the Saudis. You know, right now we can at least intimidate them a little bit and say, all right, we're going to possibly remove support for you if you keep up this stupid conflict, which is causing problems in the region. But more likely they'll just say, okay, fine, buzz off, we'll find somebody else to work with. Let's see, so I think that pretty well covers that. A little bit all over the place, but a decent summary anyway, a decent introduction, let's put it like that. Will America maintain its influence in East Asia despite not being a part of the TPP? I mean, the question implicitly assumes that it matters one way or the other. Probably America's influence in the region is going to dissipate over the next 10, 20 years, regardless of whether it's in the TPP or not. I would argue that being in the TPP would give the US more leverage in the region than it would have if it wasn't. But in general, I don't know that over the long term it will make that much difference. You know, over the long term, the big factor is China's economy. You know, as it keeps growing, it's going to have stronger and stronger ties with countries in the region, just by dint of proximity, if nothing else. And those ties will be points of leverage for the Communist Party of China to exert influence over those countries. And the United States doesn't really have any equivalent to that. The United States can, you know, give them military equipment, supplies, weapons. It can offer them diplomatic support, but it doesn't have enough economic sway in the region to counter China's economic influence. There's no way to kind of balance that out. We can sign a free trade agreement. When I say we, I mean the United States can sign a free trade agreement in the region, like the TPP. That'll increase economic ties between those countries, between Asian countries and the United States. but I don't know that the degree of the power of those ties will be really strong enough to compare with the Chinese ties. I suspect that the Chinese ties are going to be a lot more powerful, and that whatever the TPP does is going to more just mitigate the degree of China's influence than really just counter it to check it. And it's better than nothing in terms of strategically speaking. It's better to have it than not have it if you're purely concerned about U.S. influence in Asia. But regardless, it's still going to dissipate with time. And how the United States manages that is kind of an open question. There's not really a good answer to that right now as to how the United States addresses China's rise in East Asia, if not in the world generally. Nobody has a good answer to that. And part of it is going to be a function of countries in the region. You know, that's probably a lot more important because we talked a bit about this with regard to Australia last week. You know, the degree to which the countries in East Asia want to mitigate China's influence and want to kind of distance themselves to a degree so as to mitigate China's influence is going to be the more important determinant of how independent they are and autonomous they are and how strong their ties with the United States are than are anything the United States does. You know, nominally the United States should if it wants to do this, if it wants to have a strong presence and influence in the region, it should refrain from sending signals that suggest it's going to withdraw from the region or that it's not going to be as big as a player in the region. But beyond that, it really comes more down to the countries in the region, those governments. The degree to which those governments and to the degree to which they're democratic, their constituents, the populations, the degree to which they're willing to take an economic hit by mitigating economic ties with China and risking the wrath of China by taking unilateral actions, perhaps sovereign independent actions that might aggravate China. The degree to which they're willing to take those risks and take those economic costs is going to be the principal determinant of the degree to which China becomes the dominant power in the region, or if those countries end up kind of aligning more with the United States and retaining more autonomy. It's still very much up in the air. It's not even really clear that China even wants to become the dominant hegemon in the region. Nominally, it does want to be like the principal power in the region, and it wants influence over neighboring countries. But being the dominant power and just being a domineering hegemonic power, those are kind of different roles. China probably, if I had to guess, the Communist Party of China is probably more interested in just having enough influence over neighboring countries to stop them doing things that upset Chinese politics. The Communist, as we've talked about before, the Communist Party of China is much more interested in retaining power in China and controlling China's political circumstances, political environment, than it is with exercising a lot of power overseas. That's kind of just a distraction, more of just a distraction for them. And but it's possible that a certain political faction or political winds could change, or something could happen politically in China such that the government would want to be much more aggressive and domineering in the region. So in so much as that's a possibility, countries in the region are kind of hedging their bets and having to determine whether it's easier just to align with China and kind of just adhere to some of their preferred norms in terms of politics, economics, etc., or if they want to kind of curb those ties so that they can retain more independence and in turn probably have a stronger relationship with the United States. It's kind of a meandering answer all over the place, but short answer, will America maintain its influence in East Asia despite not being a part of the TPP? Probably not, but not because of not being in the TPP. That's just part of an overarching trend of diminishing influence relative to Chinese influence in the region. Let's see, do you think our government / mainstream media smears Kim Jong-un to appear worse than he really is in practice? I found a copy of his New Year's speech and it sounded a lot more reasonable than our media made it out to sound. It was also incredibly difficult to find a translated version of the speech via Google. Sketchy in and of itself. I don't think the media in the West, I assume this person is from the United States, so I'll assume he's referring to the American media, but even the Western media in general is not that familiar with Kim Jong-un. And in general, the assumption is that anything the North Korean government says, and certainly anything Kim Jong-un says, is going to be basically just pro-government propaganda. I mean, it's a authoritarian dictatorship in the sort of Stalinist mold. And public statements from the government generally are not seen as being very trustworthy, not generally seen as being very strong indicators of the government's actual preferences. They're seen as more about signaling to rival powers and, basically just trying to deter an attack, basically. Looking crazy and trying to deter an attack by seeming unstable. That's generally been the pattern as far as North Korea's public pronouncements. So I think there's kind of a learned habit on the part of Western media to largely just ignore such speeches. They're just sort of in the habit of assuming there's not a lot of substance there. So that's probably more what's responsible for them kind of marginalizing the speech in question that he made. But as for smearing Kim Jong-un in general, it kind of depends on what media you're watching. There's certainly some dramatic sensationalist media outlets out there who go out of their way to try to paint, Kim Jong-un and international events in general just in a very colorful, eventful light. And in those circumstances, yeah, they are kind of smearing him, but I think they're just doing that just for the ratings, pretty much. I don't think there's any conspiracy behind it, per se. I think outlets like, say, BBC World News or what have you are generally better about that. They generally don't editorialize his persona, paint him as being particularly villainous. Everybody has their biases. I'm not telling you to go watch BBC World News. That every outlet has its biases. But in general, I don't think there's specifically with regard to this question. I don't think it's the media's portrayal, broadly speaking, of Kim Jong-un suggests a conspiratorial intent on their part to try to manipulate the public perception of him. I think in general, the public... Sorry, go ahead.
Could you say that the more boring a news publication is, the more likely it's straightforward journalism?
I would be hesitant, because there's a moral hazard there.
Yeah.
You could say, because then it's easy. If you're a consummate bullshitter, and you want to make money bullshitting news, and that people, if you think that people think that, if there is a perception that the broader public perceives more bland news to be more serious news, and if you're more interested in getting out your message than you are in profits, then you could then go out and make a very bland news program that is just utter total bullshit.
Right, but now we're into the game theory weeds. But if they know that bland news reporting is now being metagamed by people who do saucy news that's not very well reported, then they'll do saucy news to counter and so on.
The game theory kind of progresses. It's not a one-stage game. It's a repeating game. But in general, the bulk of the population is not, I don't think, there yet. And I don't think actors, bullshit actors, if you will, quite have at the point where they're interested in going to that kind of trouble. They seem to be quite getting the results they want sufficiently using traditional bullshit methods. Dramatic news of one sort or another. Your Alex Jones type stuff. But, the major media outlets, they can do serious news when they want to. But the ratings just aren't there. This is kind of part of a broader conversation about how the media makes money, how the media stays profitable. And it's become harder and harder for media companies to stay profitable because of competition from the internet. And you could argue it's because they're biased and people want real news. Or you could argue, in contrast, that people want more biased news and are going to the internet for that. Whatever the case is, though, they're losing ratings, and so they've had to resort to more sensationalism to try to keep people entertained, to try to keep eyeballs on the screen, so to speak. And, there's no easy solution to that. You can argue that the big media companies are biased or too sensationalist or whatever, but I think whatever your perspective is, the driving force behind that is that competition from the internet and other outlets. And also people getting free news basically from the internet. It's hard to compete with free. And the more hard-pressed companies are to kind of find some way to be profitable, the more compromises they have to make, the more narrow the news gets, and the less real investigative reporting they can do. So to be fair to journalists, a lot of the reason the quality of their product has deteriorated with time has to do with trends in their industry, rather than malign intent or conspiracy on their part.
We're in the clickbait era.
Yeah, unfortunately.
That happens in this kind of content creation as well, where if you give a totally truthful representation of what your YouTube video is about, you'll get some hits. But if you play it up like you broke the game, or you got banned, or maybe you shifted the meta in some way and you have a really drastic expression, then more people click on it. So it's kind of like we're competing against people who are overhyping their stuff constantly, so everyone kind of overhypes their stuff. It's the new meta.
Yeah, getting viewer attention is a big question now. It's something the advertising industry is really struggling with, because the returns on ad dollars are diminishing. You know, there's not a lot that people really pay attention to anymore. You know, people our age grew up with more advertising, being subjected to more advertising than I think any previous generation. I think I read that somewhere. And the result of that has been a sort of instinctive learned resistance to advertising, just sort of a default ignore it attitude. And that's made it very difficult. And the collapse of traditional forms of media has made it even more difficult, because it used to be you could advertise on TV or television shows, cable TV, you know, what have you. But now fewer people are watching that. More people are online. And it's kind of difficult to advertise online because there's a lot of ad blockers that prevent people from seeing the ads in the first place. And even when there's not, people generally just ignore them anyway. And if you have too many ads on your site, people just won't come to the site in the first place. They'll just figure it's too much trouble, not worth the effort. So that's a big question, and it's an important question given how important advertising is to a lot of industries on the internet. You know, a lot of the stuff we kind of take for granted on the internet is actually paid for with advertising dollars. So it would be very unfortunate if the advertising industry basically collapsed, because that would take a good chunk of the internet environment with it. Anyway, that's kind of me going off on a tangent. I think
Tangents are fun.
I don't even know how I got onto that.
Clickbait.
Anyway. Clickbait. There you go. In media. That's what it was.
Alex Jones.
Alex
Feminists are mind-controlling men with stuff in the water that's going to make them subservient. And men everywhere are going to be overthrown. Did you know that?
I did not know that. Thank you for informing me. I can plan accordingly.
Yep.
And it kind of has echoes of, what was it? There was the old conspiracy theory about fluoridated water supplies. That's what it was. I think that even got referenced in Dr. Strangelove. I don't know how many people listening have seen Dr. Strangelove, but I highly recommend it. Very good mid-20th century Cold War movie. I think it's even in the Library of Congress now. Every so often, Congress will find a movie that it thinks encapsulates a particular era very well, and they'll incorporate it into the Library of Congress as an official entry, basically. Could you elaborate on these North Korean gray markets? Is it essentially just smuggled essential goods getting to the citizens and overlooked by low-level law enforcement? Some of it is. Some of it is smuggled goods from outside North Korea, things like media. I think I posted an article on the Twitter even today about North Korean inequality in North Korea, how people of different classes basically in North Korea live differently. And what distinguishes elites is that they have more access anyway, to foreign media. You know, they watch movies, TV shows, play games, etc. They just do it very secretly. Very, very secretly. But it is there. There is a market in smuggled goods like that. But there's also an underground market, a gray market, if you will, as you say, for just regular goods. You know, food, consumer goods made in Korea. You know, things like that. One of the reasons the famine in North Korea in the 90s was as bad as it was is because of, well, besides the drought, which fed it, but also just the inability of the government to kind of distribute goods, you know, distribute food. The mechanisms of distribution kind of broke down. And, you know, you also saw something similar with China and the Great Leap Forward, although quotas were more responsible in that case. But the North Korean government has recognized with time that, you know, it can't really replicate the role of distributor of goods and services that a market economy does naturally, at least not as efficiently as the market economy can. So they've kind of let these gray markets emerge to try to do that. So I suspect that a lot of the gray markets for You know, the lower working class and the middle class are probably more goods and services made in North Korea, whereas elites in the markets they use probably have more high-level goods, expensive goods, things like smuggled goods, equipment, luxury goods, what have you. That's my understanding anyway. I think there are some people who actually have smuggled footage of some of those markets, and I think they're on. You can see them on YouTube. It's pretty interesting stuff. You don't generally get to see what goes on in North Korea much, but some people had the balls to actually take a small camera and secret hidden camera with them and just kind of walk around a market and give you an idea of what it's like there. It's fascinating stuff. Let's see, I've heard a lot about the Arab Spring in the context of Syria. Oh, thank you. Compliment on the podcast. But what effects did it have in other countries? How far-reaching is the Arab Spring movement, and how much of the world changed because of it? How much of the world changed because of it? Pretty much just the Middle East. It was very much an Arab phenomena, you know, hence the name. So it's very localized in sort of that North Africa, Middle East area. And, it didn't even spread to, say, Iran, which is ethnically Persian. For those of you who don't know, because I know there's got to be at least one, so we'll do this now. Iran is not ethnically Arab. It does have, I think, a minority of like 10% of the population that is Arab. But most of the population is Persian or Azeri or Kurdish. And then there's a whole bunch of other smaller groups as well. But it's not an Arab country. It's an Islamic country. It is an Islamic republic, but not Arab. It has a very distinctive Persian culture, which is very different from Arab culture. And so, PSA, basically, for your information. Anyway, they were not really influenced by the Arab Spring, like, at all, really. It was very heavily localized in specifically ethnic Arab countries. And so that's pretty much the part of the world that was affected with it. And the long-term effects, you know, that's hard to judge, because we're still kind of in the short to medium term after the Arab Spring. And when you're kind of in the eye of the storm, it's hard to see what's going on. So it's kind of hard to judge just what the long-term effects will end up being. But the effects are still percolating. That's kind of what I'm saying there. And let me see. But what effects did it have in other countries? In the context of Syria. So what other countries beyond Syria did the Arab Spring affect? Okay, so the principal countries that were affected beyond Syria include Yemen, which we already talked about, so I'll leave that. Egypt, which had a substantial protest movement emerge that overthrew Hosni Mubarak, who had been the president, I think, of Egypt for the previous quarter of a century, 25 years. And so he was thrown out. And I won't get too much into the politics of each of these countries, but we can if somebody wants to. So, you know, somebody can tag Fuzzy Cord and ask the question, you know, what about Egyptian politics or whatever. But just to kind of summarize, to get through this question, you know, a little more efficiently, there was a big protest movement in Egypt. Hosni Mubarak was overthrown. There was a Muslim Brotherhood government in place for a while, led by Morsi, Mohammed Morsi, I think his name was. And then he got really unpopular, and there was another protest movement in response that was supported by the military, and then used as a pretext by the military to overthrow the Morsi government and basically return Egypt to military rule, which is basically what it was under Hosni Mubarak. So now the current president is a guy named al-Sisi. He's basically Hosni Mubarak 2.0. And he's actually probably more brutal than Mubarak was. He's trying to kind of tamper down on the kind of protest movement coup dynamic that's been going on the past past 5-10 years. And in trying to break that, he's been very sort of violent. Anyway, that's, again, we can get into that if somebody wants to, but that's been Egypt has been one of the principal countries most affected by the Arab Spring for that reason. Let's see, so we said Egypt, Yemen, Syria. So then the obvious example would be Tunisia. And Tunisia is where it started in the first place. There was a cart seller. No, he was basically he's a guy who sold food on the side of the road from a cart. And in a country where there's a lot of corruption and etc., like Tunisia was under the Ben Ali regime, police generally are very extractive. You know, that's kind of a recurring phenomenon in a lot of countries that suffer from corruption. Police will use the very wide scope of regulations and, well, the regulatory regime in general on part of the state to try to extract value by demanding bribes. So technically it was illegal for that guy to be selling food out of his cart where he was doing it. That's the reason that's a dumb law is a whole conversation in and of itself, so I'll leave that where it is. We might touch on that later, but it was illegal. A police officer, it was actually a female police officer, if I remember correctly, but a police officer approached him and basically demanded a bribe in exchange for not arresting him. And he couldn't pay it, he didn't have the money, and so the cart, this actually happened, the cart was impounded. The police officer took this poor guy's cart, and it was his only means of income. There was a lot of poverty in Tunisia, and remained so. And you know, selling food on the side of the road, there's a technical name for that. It's just it's slipping my mind. But that being his principal source of income, he was basically left destitute. And he was immensely frustrated by that, as you can imagine. And so he decided to immolate himself. He went to a crowded area in Tunis, I think, the capital. No, it wasn't Tunis either. It was more in sort of one of the rural areas. Whatever. Regardless, he went to a crowded place in the city near where he lived, doused himself in gasoline, and set himself on fire. And he did that in protest, basically, to the government's corruption, to the economy being badly managed, etc. Basically, just to the whole status quo. And that's what sparked protests all over the Arab world, because basically almost all of the Arab world suffers from similar problems with corruption, authoritarianism, abuses of power, etc. So what happened in Tunisia after that was there was a mass protest movement. Again, this is the truncated version. There was a mass protest movement. The Ben Ali regime was overthrown. He fled the country, and a new democratic government was instituted. And out of all the countries that have been impacted by the Arab Spring, Tunisia has probably been, has easily been the most successful in inculcating a new democratic government. There are some warts here and there. It's not perfect, but it's head and tails, top of the group, best of the lot. They do have a democratic government. They have had elections. There have been election disputes that have been resolved peacefully. All political actors in the country have respected the rule of the judiciary and have adhered to not only the laws of the political system in Tunisia that have been set up, but also the norms that have been set up, which is probably more important. That's the significant leap forward for Tunisian politics, is the establishment of political norms and the adherence to said norms. So that's a big step forward for them. They've been adhering to that for the most part since the Arab Spring, pretty much. Again, not perfect, some issues with emergency rule and etc., terrorism, what have you, but for the most part, they've been doing pretty decent. You don't hear about them much because not a lot dramatic happens there. I think the most people have heard from Tunisia since then have been the terrorist attacks that attacked a tourist resort in Tunisia. But beyond that, very quiet. And from what I've read, though, it's an encouraging story. So Tunisia, and then I think the other big example would be of an Arab country affected by the Arab Spring would be Libya. I think it was maybe a couple months after the Arab Spring kind of got started in earnest. This would have been, I guess, mid-2011 or so. Protests started in eastern Libya, flared up, and, well, we could talk about the course of the Libyan civil war, but that's a whole conversation in of itself. So again, truncated version, mass protest in eastern Libya, some protests in western Libya, the government cracks down, civil war breaks out, there are defections from the army, kind of similar to Syria in some ways. And they kind of go back and forth. Anybody who remembers kind of paying attention to this Libyan civil war kind of remembers the back and forth that went on between the middle of the country. The rebels would push from the east, from Benghazi towards Tripoli, they would get checked. The army would push back towards Benghazi, they would be checked, and they did that a couple times before Western intervention came in and kind of threw the war in the favor of the rebels. Again, more complicated than that, but this is the truncated version. And so the government, of course, was overthrown. The Gaddafi regime was overthrown. And then since then, there was an attempt anyway to establish a democratic government, but different political factions in different regions of Libya, specifically East versus West being the principal division, were not able to kind of reconcile between them what kind of government they wanted and to reconcile tensions between them. The emergence of a military strongman leader in eastern Libya hasn't helped matters because people in western Libya don't particularly trust him. Having just overthrown a strongman leader, they're not particularly eager to have another one, so that's made things more difficult. And of course there's the foreign element as well. Egypt and the Saudis, I suspect, and the Emiratis, for that matter, are supporting General Haftar in eastern Libya, whereas the western Libya government is being supported explicitly by Qatar and nominally by the West, although the West is trying to encourage, really the West is supporting kind of a third party, a sort of national government that they want to push, but the Westerners and the Easterners aren't really keen on it, so that's more of a nominal faction at this point, a faction on paper. So those are that's a rough summary of the different countries that were most affected by the Arab Spring, and I think that's what you were asking. You try to... What effects did it have in other countries? Okay, yeah, I think that's a rough summary of what effects it had in other countries. There were also some protests in Morocco and Algeria, as well as the Sudan, if I'm remembering correctly. And let's see, not so much Palestine, not Iraq. Iraq was kind of busy with its own problems at the time. There were actually some protests in Iraq, but they tied in more to pre-existing tensions between the Sunni and Shia Shia groups within Iraq. And then actually those protests later evolved into the Islamic State invasion. Basically the Sunni... Well, okay, that's a tangent, but if somebody wants to talk about Iraqi politics, we can get into that. Please feel free to ask. Ask Fuzzy Cord and we can get into it. But there were some protests in Iraq, but they weren't really tied to the Arab Spring. Syria, obvious. Not really much protest in Lebanon. And there wasn't really much that happened in Saudi Arabia. There was a little, but the government was pretty quick to crack down on it. There was also some protests in Bahrain that were more serious. The population there is like 60% Shia, 40% Sunni, and the Shias have kind of felt maligned by the government. And they rose up. Well, not rise up, but there was a significant protest movement on their part that the government cracked down on. And the government was sufficiently afraid that they actually invited the Saudis to send their military in. And there's actually a bridge, apparently, connecting the island of Bahrain. Bahrain is an island, if you didn't know. There's actually a bridge connecting Saudi Arabia to Bahrain, and the Saudis used that to send their military in to help the Bahraini government stabilize the situation. People were pretty upset about that. I think I don't know anything about car racing, so you'll have to forgive my ignorance here, but there is some big race that is held in Bahrain, and that ended up getting delayed. It was something of a hit to the economy. But beyond that, the other problem with that implication there, the wider implication there, was that it made the United States look bad because the United States has a significant naval base in Bahrain. I think the 7th Fleet is headquartered there. Something to that effect anyway. The United States has a lot of military assets in Bahrain, basically. And so the United States was in the awkward position of either maintaining the stability of Bahrain and in turn its strategic utility as an American ally, but then in turn kind of alienating the broader Middle East because they're kind of not propping up an authoritarian government per se, but not putting pressure on an authoritarian government to open up to a reform movement, if you want to call that a reform movement. One of the reasons the Bahraini government and the Saudi government were so eager to crack down in Bahrain was that there was a suspicion the Shia protesters were somehow connected to Iran. Again, not entirely clear the degree to which that's true, but as we discussed earlier, suspicion is enough when you're dealing with a rival who engages in ambiguous activities in a region. That's kind of subjective. Sometimes it's not enough. It's kind of up to you to decide. But obviously, for the Saudi government, suspicion is enough. So they've been cracking down and helping the Bahraini government crack down on those people, on those protesters anyway. It's stabilized a good deal since then. There were a few protests in Qatar as well, but they didn't go anywhere. I think the Qatari government has been much better about maintaining its legitimacy by adhering to certain populist activities, things like having the Al Jazeera channel, supporting Islamist movements in the region, etc. That kind of gives the government a little more leeway with its population than certain other governments which are more repressive. I don't think anything happened in Oman. I think there might have been like one token protest in Oman, but it didn't go anywhere. People live pretty well in Oman, relatively speaking. That'll probably change after the Sultan dies because he doesn't have any heirs. That's a succession crisis in the making. That's probably not going to end well. But for now, Oman has one of the better leaders, one of the better, basically, sultans in the region, and so they've been very quiet. Probably haven't even heard about them. That's how quiet they've been. But I think that's about it. I think that about runs the gamut of countries affected by the Arab Spring. I guess you could go into like secondary effects, like countries that have been affected by it indirectly in like Europe or whatever, but I didn't get the impression that was the gist of the question. So if you do want to get into that, you can ask Fuzzy Cord and he'll direct it and we can kind of get into it. But for now, I'll leave it at that. I guess there is, you also asked how far reaching was the movement and how much of the world changed because of it. The movement hasn't had a lot of legs, unfortunately. There was a lot of hope at the beginning that there would be significant a significant shift towards liberal democratic governance. But most of the cases either ended in civil war, a la Libya, Syria, or they resulted in a retrenchment of the regime in question, Egypt being the principal example there. Tunisia is pretty much the only case where there was significant change. And there were a lot of cases where there was some protest, but then nothing changed at all, really. Those are kind of most of the cases I just cited were those, you know, Algeria, Morocco, Bahrain, etc. So for the most part, there hasn't been a whole lot of change on account of it, but you could say that the change has been more of a change of spirit. There's more a sense that there is people power and that people power can be used to affect change in the region, that the region status quo is not permanent. It need not be permanent anyway. It's kind of an 1848 situation. There was a big liberal revolt in 1848 in Europe. People wanting more liberal governance, more liberal policies, less monarchies, basically. And it did not really go anywhere. It did lead to reforms later, some moderation. It had long-term effects. But the short-term effect was that the revolts were pretty much all crushed, and that short-term change was pretty minimal. The Arab Spring is more like that. So for now, the changes are not that significant. The status quo has been shaken, but has not been destroyed or substantially altered in most cases. But over the long term, it could be that it sets the tone for a series of reforms that over time change the region. You know, Saudi Arabia is an example of that. I don't think Saudi Arabia is reforming now because of the Arab Spring. But the tensions that caused the Arab Spring, I think, are pushing Saudi Arabia to try to reform. Or at least pushing Mohammed bin Salman to want to reform. That's a whole other conversation in and of itself, though. Let's see. I think it's a meandering, all over the place answer, but I think I've pretty much answered the question. If not, feel free to ask, and we can kind of get into it. Just as an aside here, I haven't given it yet, so I'll give the usual disclaimer I give every week. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about. I'm kind of a hobbyist in a lot of this. I have some expertise in economics, political economy, etc. I'm pretty familiar with some topics I've been kind of hobbying in for longer, like history and whatnot. But there's some things that have a more introductory understanding of. It's a broad ambit, but and so if I say something stupid, or if I say something you disagree with, or if I say something biased, or what have you, or if you just have any general feedback, all of that is welcome and appreciated. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody, so please do participate in chat. It is meant to be more of a conversational experience. I don't read chat while we do this, but I do read it after the fact. So I will see your comments later when I kind of sit down and go through it. And so participation is encouraged in that regard. And criticism of anything I say also encouraged in that regard. I had to write all that down just so I can read it, because it's hard to remember it all off the top of my head every week.
Yep.
Let's see. So what effect will the new Cuban president have on Cuba, and what does it mean for Cuban-American relations? So the new guy was chosen, and I don't remember his name, unfortunately, but the new president of Cuba is replacing Raul Castro, who is Fidel Castro's brother. And he just was basically announced, his, whatever you want to call that, inauguration, let's say, was announced, I think, this past week or so. And he was chosen specifically because he was not a controversial candidate. He's been in the party he's been in the Communist Party in Cuba a long time. He's pretty orthodox. From the public speeches he's made thus far, he's cut a very orthodox figure in terms of communism, economic policy, etc. So it doesn't seem like there's going to be much change. It seems like Raul Castro and his people wanted to pick a guy who they thought would continue the legacy of the revolution, perhaps with a few minor reforms going forward, but basically someone who would not rock the boat. And so if that, in so much as that impression is accurate, and it is an impression, I'm not a Cuba expert, but in so much as that impression is accurate, I don't think we can expect a whole lot of change on the island anytime soon. As far as the impact on Cuban-American relations, I don't think there will be any change. I don't think the new guy is going to be any more interested in giving significant concessions to the United States than the Castro brothers were. And the Trump administration, for its part, is definitely not interested in giving any concessions. that might ameliorate relations. They're pretty content to take a pretty hard line on Cuba, or at least a relatively hard line. I guess it could be a lot harder. But in general, there seems to be a lack of interest in really opening up the relationship like there was under the Obama administration. So I suspect, and I think somebody even asked this last week, and so I basically have the same answer. I suspect the relations between the U.S. and Cuba will be status quo for the foreseeable future for as long as the Trump administration is in power. Maybe if the Cuban government comes forward with a big initiative, a bold proposal, maybe that could go somewhere, but I would be skeptical, since I doubt they would be willing to give the kind of concessions that the U.S. government would ask for. And I doubt the U.S. government is going to be interested in offering such an initiative for its part, initiating such a proposal on its part. So there's just kind of a lack of interest and a lack of willingness to kind of really go down that path. Let's see, since all of this is happening within the backdrop of Trump ignoring the Iran deal, do you think North Korea is undergoing these talks, hoping the U.S. will violate the deal like Clinton did in the 90s with North Korea, and Trump is doing with Iran? Let's see, I don't think so. Within the backdrop of Trump isn't ignoring the Iran deal yet. He says he will. There's a good chance he will, but he hasn't done it yet. He's just signaling right now, and it could be the signaling is just part of a strategy of pressure to try to get the Iranians to agree to some new concessions as part of the kind of a revised Iran deal. But we'll see. That's speculation on my part. But basically, how does that tie into North Korea? Is North Korea hoping the U.S. will violate the deal like Clinton did in the 90s? I don't think so. I don't think North Korea really is paying a whole lot of attention to the Iran deal per se. I think they, if the United States attacked Iran or just, abandoned the deal completely, that might be problematic. But I think in general, North Korea kind of has its own, the North Korea nuclear issue has its own diplomatic ecosystem, its own circumstances. And those circumstances are very different to those of Iran. Iran is actually, well, maybe they're not more isolated per se, because North Korea is a lot more isolated, I think, because their only principal ally is China. But the thing is, ally is a much more powerful and stronger, powerful ally and has stronger ties to North Korea than any other country that Iran could point to. Iran has nominal ties with Russia, but they're not really allies, and those ties are pretty weak. Russia has proven willing in the past to put pressure on Iran vis-a-vis the nuclear program when conditions are right. So Iran doesn't really have like a big protector like China in its corner, like North Korea does. And that's a big factor in the negotiation. So whether or not the United States abandons the nuclear deal with Iran or not, I don't think will play too much of a role in the North Korea negotiations. I think the more important factor in the North Korea negotiations will be the degree to which China is willing to guarantee North Korea's security. North Korea would be much more willing to give concessions if it knows it has China at its back than it would otherwise, whereas Iran doesn't really have that kind of guarantor. Like, there's no big country like China that would guarantee Iran's security if they abandoned their nuclear program. I don't think Russia would be interested. Maybe if there were that would be a significant shift in the diplomatic situation in the region as a whole if Russia and Iran had an outright alliance. But I don't think either country really wants ties that close. I think both of them want the freedom to maneuver to pursue their own interests in so much as they diverge. They do have some things in common. There is kind of a common desire to prop up the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, and a common desire to kind of roll back the American-led world order in so much as that's a thing. Basically a desire to mitigate American hegemony and the pressure the United States can bring to bear on them. But beyond that, there's not a lot in common. They have in common. Other than that, pretty much the only thing they would want to do with each other is economic ties. I might add that when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, and the Islamic Republic was, well, the Islamic Republic wasn't actually formed until some months after that, after the fact. But anyway, if you know about the Islamic Revolution, you know about the hostage crisis in which revolutionaries stormed a U.S. embassy and took several hundred, I think it was several hundred anyway, U.S. embassy workers hostage, and they held them for like a year plus. Actually, the revolutionaries that did that had a real conversation about whether or not they should storm the Soviet embassy, because actually there was a lot of enmity towards the Soviets as well. They ended up going with the U.S. embassy. But it's not as though there's a great deal of love and affection amongst the broader Iranian population for Russia. They are traditional rivals, and they have not had a particularly altruistic relationship over the past 100 years. Certainly not before that. Anyway, I'm kind of running off onto a tangent here. Basically, I don't think that the Iranian nuclear negotiation, such as it is, vis-a-vis the United States and Iran, is that impactful for North Korea. And so I don't think the North Korean government would really care that much one way or the other what the United States does. Maybe if the United States breaks the Iranian nuclear deal explicitly, then the North Korean government could say, see, you're negotiating in bad faith and we want more concessions. But I don't think it would change the underlying calculus. I think the North Korean government, again, to kind of retread what I talked about earlier, the North Korean government is concerned about unilateral American military action, and it's concerned that the Chinese will not back them if they keep their nuclear weapons program. That's the more important calculus as far as the North Koreans go. What happens vis-a-vis the Iran nuclear deal might impact the degree of concessions they ask for, but overall I don't think it would change the trajectory of that whole set of negotiations on the peninsula. I'm sorry if that's a little bit incoherent. Thoughts are a little jumbled there. My apologies. And I hope I'm reading the question right. If not, you can elaborate and I can kind of come back to it. And I would be happy to come back to it. Let's see. If you could interview a world leader, who would it be and what would you ask? I don't know. I'm terrible with hypothetical questions. I always have been. So I always struggle with these. I really don't know. Do they have to be alive? Can I talk to a dead leader? There's some interesting historical figures you could talk to. I guess I'll assume here you mean somebody who's alive. The trouble there is a lot of the most interesting people you would talk to would probably not be honest with you. Because people like Xi Jinping or Bashar al-Assad, they're not going to give you like the full unvarnished truth, are they? They're going to have a particular perspective that they're going to try to push. I guess there's a lot of people in more open, liberal, democratic states you could talk to, but they're not quite as interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Barack Obama. He seems interesting. Or Donald Trump. He's a very colorful figure. I don't know what we would talk about, though.
Would you want to talk to him with a camera on him or in private?
Probably.
Because I feel like he would be comparatively different.
Yeah.
He's a bit of a showman.
Probably in private. I guess I'd been assuming that if I were to interview a world leader, it would be on camera. But yeah, given the choice, private would be better because they would be more honest and forthright, which I would be more interested in. I don't know. Neuro, you might be better at this question. What kind of world leader would you want to talk to and interview?
I mean, Abraham Lincoln, I feel like didn't have as much of an opportunity to say his stuff because he was killed earlier than a lot of other ones. And he was a president at a really key time. So to kind of see his vision for the future, and also he was a boxer as well. So maybe like, hey, do you want to like spar a little bit? That would be cool. He was apparently really tall and ugly too, which is awesome.
It's an interesting approach to interviews. Let's box.
Yeah. Well, you can learn a lot about someone by trying to punch them in the face and seeing what they do. People talk a lot in politics, but like we're saying before, you don't really know who's the best at punching until it comes to terms.
Fair point. Fair point. Yeah, as expected, Neuro much better at answering the hypothetical than I am.
Well, I think part of it with the hypothetical is to not be too worried about getting the right answer. It's like having fun with an answer is kind of the approach that I take with that.
That's a good point. Yeah, I'm not the best at that. I'm not having fun or just life in general. Those are not things I'm very good at. Let's see. Has there ever been talk of taking back or being given back the Hawaiian kingdom? I'm sure there's an independence movement in Hawaii. It's probably not much bigger than the number of people you could fit in a small room, though. Now, I don't know how much interest there is in a independence movement in Hawaii, and there's not a lot of indigenous left in Hawaii. There's a fair number there, but I don't think they're in a minority. You know, most of the population is either white, descended from people from the mainland, or they're descended from Asians who migrated later. I think Japanese and Filipinos are the principal ancestry groups for Hawaii right now. And I don't think any of them are that keen on a Hawaiian kingdom, you know, being returned. So they would be pretty hard pressed to pull it off, and I think if only for that reason, any independence movement in Hawaii doesn't have a lot of support, at least not sufficient support to be apparent to me, or in media for that matter. For those who don't know, Hawaii used to be an independent kingdom. I think it was a monarchy, and then some American, what was it, sugar plantation owners, I think. Some American entrepreneurs came and started some sugar plantations in Hawaii. And yeah, from there they basically overthrew the government in the late 1800s and asked the United States to accept them as a new territory. And that's how it got to be a part of the United States. That's a very truncated, summarized version of the story, but basically that's it in a nutshell. And I don't think that there's much sentiment there for independence, so I would say probably not. Or being given back. You know, you could probably find some people who are not indigenous, but who are sympathetic to a return to Hawaii, a return of the Hawaiian kingdom. But even there, I don't think there would be enough support. There's probably enough nationalists and conservatives in Hawaii to block such a move, I would suspect. The United States government has reacted somewhat poorly to previous separatist movements. I don't know that I would want to test them again, given what happened the last time. But yeah, I haven't heard anything. That's the short answer. Let's see. Several U.S. cities have recently decided the services they receive from telecom providers, many of which operate as de facto monopolies that refuse to invest in infrastructure upgrades, are unsatisfactory and have begun building their own publicly owned networks. The telecoms are fighting hard to avoid this competition. Is this part of a larger trend of waning tolerance of monopoly? I don't know that it's a part of a waning trend of tolerance for monopolies, because, you know, if there were such a trend, there would be a lot more traction on antitrust reform. There would be more and more powerful antitrust legislation being proposed. As far as I know, there's not. And yeah, I haven't heard anything in that vein to substantiate that. That's not to say there isn't, just that I haven't heard it. So if it's there, I'm not familiar with that. But there is kind of this trend of localities kind of trying to get their own internet infrastructure. I think telecoms, I think, have been largely successful in stymieing that on legal grounds. I can't remember off the top of my head just what the legal justification was for blocking it. But I think for the most part they've done that. That might have started to change recently. I haven't been following it closely, so maybe this person is more familiar with it. Oh, it's fuzzy cord. You might be more familiar with it than I am, fuzzy cord. But I just haven't heard much on that count in order to kind of, in terms of a trend there. But I don't think it's part of a larger trend against monopolies. And some people have been talking about Facebook and as a monopoly and what social media companies as monopolies, but I don't think it quite fits. I don't think those are really monopolies per se. You could kind of make the argument, but something like Facebook or a social media company, their value doesn't come from their monopolization of the market. It comes more from network effect, which is this idea in economics that a service or a good is more valuable the more people use it. And hypothetically, it wouldn't be hard for people to shift en masse from one social media platform to another. Hypothetically, everybody could leave Facebook and go to another one. That's within the realm of possibility. Whereas with a traditional monopoly, you really can't do that. Like there is no, hence the name monopoly. Monopoly means there's no alternative. You have one single producer. And in that case, there's just no alternative. Whereas there are alternatives to Facebook, it's just that they're not as valuable or attractive because not as many people use them. Probably more people would switch if there was more coordination, but it's very difficult to coordinate, 10 people, again, over a pizza, say, let alone millions of people using a social media site. So the issue there is more one of coordination than it is one of monopoly. Hypothetically, you could start a movement in order to try to coordinate consumers on social media companies in order to try to pressure them better, in order to adhere to certain norms of behavior that you might want them to adhere to, such as norms regarding, say, data or data privacy, which is, of course, is what's been in the news. But I don't think you would call that a monopoly per se.
Well, for people in esports, we're still kind of comfortable having multiple social media platforms that we each use. So like I have a social command that includes my Twitter, my YouTube, my Patreon, and then my Twitch would be another avenue for that. So if people have like 4 or 5 different things, Instagram, Snapchat, a bunch of different avenues where they express themselves and network with other people, giving up one really isn't that big of a deal. And most of us, at least if we're, say, 25 plus, used MySpace or something and migrated to Facebook over time, and it wasn't really that big of a deal. So Facebook is king of the hill right now for a big part of social media, but I don't really use Facebook that much anymore. That's more for like networking with friends and family at this point instead of email. Whereas for business, it's Twitch and YouTube and Patreon for me. And then for networking with people within esports and on Twitch, it's Twitter, is how we generally talk to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not quite a monopolistic environment, in summary.
Yeah, it kind of depends on what the platform does and how people use it. Yeah. Facebook is not the end-all, be-all. They have stuff like streaming games, but the functionality isn't super good. It was kind of a gimmick that they tried to push for a while. I don't know if you knew about it, but there was a major Dota tournament that apparently Facebook bought the rights to be the exclusive broadcaster for, and the Dota community shit the bed super hard. They were like, fuck this. You don't make us go to a different website to watch a tournament. Facebook is stupid. Brah, put it on Twitch. So they didn't do that again.
Let's see. At what point will Turkey's rise become a threat to American interest? I don't know that I would call it a rise per se, because Turkey's not really becoming more powerful. It's just becoming more independent. You know, previously their foreign policy had been kind of tethered to the West, generally, broadly speaking. And the government under Erdogan is kind of just taking a different tact. They still have the alliance with the West, but they're becoming more, shall we say, what's the word I want? Forceful? No, not forceful. Well, they're being more outgoing with their interests, even where those interests diverge with their Western partners.
They're making more noise now.
Making more noise, being more willful, you know, just kind of having more of a separate policy that pursues their own interests more narrowly. And you know, economically they've been doing better, but the economy in Turkey has kind of stagnated now for a while, for the past, year or two. It's grown a bit, but it's not growing as much as it was. And I don't think they've sent any signals yet that they're willing to challenge the West militarily in a substantive way. You know, mostly, there are tensions with the West, but the tensions are mostly done for political theater, near as I can tell. I don't really take seriously the... there is nominally better relations between Turkey and Russia. There's kind of a détente there, sort of rapprochement, but it's pretty limited, and it's very narrow in scope, I think. I think it's pretty specifically focused on Syria, rather than part of a broader trend towards aligning more as part of a new bloc, you know, a sort of Turco-Russian bloc, if you will. I'm pretty skeptical that they're going to go that direction, since there's a lot of there's some differing interests there. And again, the trend is more towards Turkey being more independent, so I don't think the government is that interested in joining a new bloc when it's still trying to get out of the old one. I think they're trying to just increase their discretionary power vis-a-vis all other countries, not just the West. But I don't think it's really rising per se, and I don't think the trend is really towards being a threat. I don't think they're a threat to American interests, really. I mean, American interests in the region are pretty limited to begin with. I mean, it's more of an abstract interest in terms of making sure there's not another oil shock in the vein of the 1970s. That's the principal American interest in the Middle East, more than anything. That doesn't really tie in much to Turkey, and Turkey doesn't seem to want to do much to really intrude on that. They've kind of entered the region's politics a little bit in so much as they've allied with Qatar. Qatar being sort of the black sheep of the region. You know, they're more interested in reform and maybe a little bit of political Islam, whereas the Saudis and the other monarchies are more interested in repression and making sure that alternative political movements don't arise. So Turkey is aligning more with the Qataris and is kind of giving the Qataris diplomatic support, and vice versa. They're getting money and support from the Qataris as well in Syria. But that hasn't really gone anywhere. It doesn't seem like the Turkish government is that interested in leveraging it into any greater ambitions for the region. So I don't really see a lot of threat there. I mean, you could argue that the United States has an interest in the Kurds, and in so much as the Turks are threatening the Kurds, they could be said to be threatening American interests in the region, but America doesn't have that much of an interest in the Kurds. That's just more of a point of leverage that could be used in Syria, more than anything. So it would not be hard for the United States to kind of walk away if things got too hot there. That's not like a core American interest. It's more just something that's desired. It's a want, not a need, put it like that. Whereas the security interest in protecting the Saudis and the Gulf oil supplies, that's more of a need than a want, at least as far as what's perceived in Washington. At least as far as national security perceptions in Washington. Stuff like that. So yeah, I just don't really see a vector for a threat to happen. It seems like a lot of what the Turkish government does that looks threatening is more theater and rhetoric than anything, and most of the substantive actions they take are done for domestic political considerations and are very narrow in scope and are mostly limited to Syria more than anything. I'm open to criticism on that.
They fight for freedom. And we're American. We love freedom.
Well, Turks love freedom too. They just define it a bit differently right now. A lot differently. But I'm open to criticism on this. I'm not a Turkey expert, so I would welcome alternative opinions in chat. Please feel free to contribute if you have a different perspective on that. But that's my perception. There's not really a lot of substance to the idea that Turkey is some kind of threat to the United States. Let's see. Are there any considerable legal implications to the fact that Trump paid off a porn star to cover up infidelity? Possibly. From what I read, there might be some campaign finance issues, because apparently it's illegal to use campaign finance money to pay a porn star to remain silent about a possible affair. Apparently. So that's being looked into. I don't know. It's not illegal to pay off a porn star to basically be quiet. Hush money, basically, is what we call it in the U.S. It's not illegal to pay a porn star hush money. What's illegal is if the money came from a campaign finance, basically trow. Oh. And so that's what's being investigated. Sorry, what?
I was just finding that amusing.
Oh, yeah, trow. There's probably a better word. Just can't. It's what came to mind.
Oh, I wasn't saying a word. That was onomatopoeia. I was like, wow.
Oh, gotcha.
That has to be a rule. Because someone did that. That's how the rules work, isn't it? Someone tried to do it and they're like, no, that's the campaign funds. You can't use the campaign funds for that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's part of a broader set of laws about what you can and cannot spend campaign funds on. So I doubt the legal code says specifically no hush money to porn stars. Probably it's more you can only spend this on campaign-related activities, because that's what the money was given to you for. So to kind of say you're going to spend it on campaign money but then spend it on something else, that's a kind of fraud, basically. So I'm not a lawyer here, so I'm talking a bit out of my ass, but this is my limited understanding that if a law was broken, it would be because campaign finance money was used to pay this porn star, Stormy Daniels, and that's what's being investigated. If they find that the money didn't come from the campaign finance funds, actually funds is a better word than trow, if it came from that fund, or alternatively, if they don't have enough evidence to determine one way or the other, then it won't go anywhere. So that's what I know about it, which isn't a whole lot, but as far as I know, that's what the investigation is about, and I don't think it's really gone anywhere yet. There hasn't been any news on that as of yet. I'm sure there's a court case in progress. I think I remember reading about it. I'm sure somebody would have jumped on the opportunity as soon as it arose. I know that Stormy Daniels herself is initiating legal action because, well, no, she didn't initiate legal action. He did. Well, actually, okay. All right. I don't quite remember. Somebody's suing somebody. Either Trump sued her or she sued Trump. over the violation or over the non-disclosure agreement that she signed. And from what I read, she's actually holding her own pretty well. I'm sure it's driving Trump himself insane, because like we were talking about earlier, he has a big ego and he really feels it necessary to constantly defend his image. And given how much he's coming under attack from Stormy Daniels and her lawyer, I've got to imagine that he's really, really having to restrain himself. His lawyers have probably just got him at the edge of his leash.
So he's more than moderately upset.
Yeah, it's probably more than moderately upset. He's already shared some vitriol on Twitter about it, but it probably wants to do more. Because generally that's the pattern. When people attack Trump, at least high-profile people, he always hits back, like invariably. And he doesn't seem to be hitting back tit for tat like he usually does with the Stormy Daniels case. Yeah, it would seem like things like the Russia investigation and things like the Stormy Daniels case seem to be the most effective weapons to disrupt Donald Trump. If not at a political level, then at a personal level. But anyway, as far as the question goes, that's my understanding of it. What do you think of the U.S. political reaction to the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica-related hearings? There wasn't a whole lot of reaction to be had, really. I don't think anybody's done much or proposed to do much. I think there's a few politicians who are kind of trying to turn it into an election platform, kind of turn it into an issue on which they can campaign. You know, they're kind of trying to paint themselves as the data privacy guy. But beyond that, I don't think there's been a whole lot of traction politically on that. I mean, the hearing itself, we talked about the hearing last week. You know, I would reiterate what I said last week, that it was largely a horse and pony show and that nothing of substance will probably change. But yeah, I haven't seen any substantive change on that count. I did have some notes about that. Maybe I should try to conjure them here. Let's see. Yeah, people are kind of hung up on their data being used by Cambridge Analytica specifically, I think. I think that's been more the catalyst for a lot of this. But there really wasn't anything illegal about that per se. There was an abuse of data, that's what the media keeps saying, but really that was just a guy who gathered some data on Facebook through normal channels, and then he just decided to sell it, which apparently you're not supposed to do. But the thing is, you can't really regulate that. I mean, if you don't want people to pass on the data, you shouldn't let them have it at all. Because it's really difficult. It's basically impossible to determine whether somebody passes on data, unless the data is very distinctive, such that you could recognize it later when somebody else uses it. You kind of can't prevent somebody from having data on their computer and then copy-pasting it someplace else, which is basically what selling data amounts to. I mean, did he delete the data? Maybe. You would have to look at his computer, and then you would have to look at every other electronic device he had handled since he got the data, because he could have copy-pasted it anywhere. So there's a legal issue there with making sure that they actually get rid of data they say they're going to get rid of. So tacit in the status quo is the expectation that, yes, it's easy to kind of do that, but that most people will probably adhere to the terms of service and delete the data that they promised to delete. And that if they don't, well, that's just an inherent risk, and that it's a cost worth paying to have a sort of laissez-faire data privacy regime, which is basically what we have right now. Some people don't like that as much. Again, they don't like the idea, I guess, of Cambridge Analytica in particular having their data, although I don't know why. Cambridge. I've heard a lot of weird things about Cambridge Analytica, like there's some kind of mastermind organization, you know, conspiring behind the scenes to buy elections and manipulate elections, but they're not doing that with data, if they're doing it at all. The things they've gotten the most in trouble for have been the things like honey trap operations that they technically copped to, and that BBC, what was it? It was basically a hidden camera report that the BBC did with one of their high-level people. But just having data doesn't give you, just having large amounts of data about people that allows you to profile large numbers of people is not in and of itself enough to allow you to buy elections and manipulate people, etc. I think Cambridge Analytica's ability to do so, and really anybody's ability to do so, has been a bit oversold on that count. Possibly by people who really want data privacy and kind of haven't had a vector to do it. People have been pretty bland and meh about data privacy issues over the past 10 years.
Well, we could also tie it in to the clickbait point we were making before, of how this is a thing that is going through our kind of public experience, and for people who are trying to make money in the media, they're gonna hype it up a whole bunch like it's a huge deal.
Yeah, it's a good strategy, and people involved in activism, NGOs, what have you, they're pretty familiar with the tactic. You know, they've had to rely on it a lot, because sometimes people just don't want to get money unless something's blowing up. So if you're really passionate about your project and you think it has real value, and nobody's giving you money, well, you kind of have to make that judgment call. Is this worth bullshitting people over and getting some revenue coming in? And a lot of them do. And that's just how it's done. That's just sort of a standard operating procedure for a lot of organizations that have to raise money like that. But as far as the Cambridge Analytica thing, I think the more important issue than data privacy, broadly speaking, or preventing PSYOPs groups, somebody online called them a PSYOPs group on some
awesome.
message board I was reading. It's not a PSYOPs group, suffice to say. I would strongly argue that's the case. To a degree, it's a matter of opinion, but I would strongly argue against that notion. But I think the more important issues, I think there's three issues here. One, defining consent, because there is definitely a legitimate argument to be made that social media companies do not do enough to explicitly get consent. And certainly there's a debate to be had about whether or not the public would prefer a regime where consent is implicitly assumed just by using the service, as opposed to explicitly given by having an explicit agreement of some kind, you know, having to check or sign something, some electronic document, so that they know that you have your permission, and that if they don't have that, then they don't have permission. Which regime is preferred? There's a debate to be had there, and the public should have its kind of day to kind of make that decision. And then the other issue is the creation of a market for surveillance, which I haven't really heard talked about much, really, at least not directly, which is the idea that what if people did in real life what they're doing online now, which is collecting information about where you go and what you do, creating a profile, and then selling it. Like if you had people on the street photographing you, recording your movements, writing down where you went, who you talked to, etc., would people be comfortable with that? Probably not, I would wager. But it's also not really explicitly illegal per se. And the only reason it hasn't happened traditionally is because there hasn't really been a market for it. Why do that? You know, there has been a market for private investigators, and they do something like that, or have done something like that historically, but it was never done en masse. It was not industrial scale surveillance, like what can be done online. You know, the internet and computers have made that possible, have made mass surveillance possible for at a commercial level. So the creation of such a market online raises questions, basically. Is this something that we're comfortable with? Do we want broad segments of the public to have basically what amount to public profiles about everybody? And you know, opinions will differ on that, but it's a conversation worth having that hasn't been had yet, and that we're kind of only beginning to have. And again, I don't think anybody's really talked about it in those terms, at least not that I've read. I haven't followed it closely, so maybe I've just missed it. That's quite possible. And then a third point that I would raise is that internet literacy. You know, part of the reason that people are so shocked by the whole Facebook thing is that I think a lot of people just didn't know Facebook was gathering that much data about them. You know, so I think there's a literacy issue as far as people not understanding how social media companies make money, how they operate, what data laws are, etc. So I think there is kind of a need for education. I hate to default to education because that's kind of a lazy default a lot of people go to answer difficult, complex policy questions. But part of the solution to this issue will probably be education on the electronic market, the internet market, social media firms, etc., to try to get people to understand what they're getting into, so that they don't end up being surprised, so they don't sign up to something that they don't understand. So those are three aspects that that came to mind when I was trying to think about the whole Facebook Cambridge Analytica privacy issue. Some random errant thoughts, if you will. I might have had more on it somewhere, but I'm not sure where it is. So I hope that's kind of sufficient to answer the question. I guess it is kind of just what's your, what an opinion question, basically. What's your opinion? My opinions tend to be a bit disjointed and all over the place, so they're not always satisfying. But, you know, that's what I can come up with. Let's see. With its recent ban on messaging service Telegram, is Russian media policy moving towards a Chinese-type model, or are they just exacting vengeance on a political enemy? I don't think it's either. I don't think they see Telegram as a political enemy. I think they just see Telegram as, I think they're just trying to exert sovereignty on the internet. I think they just want to control that space, or at least have regulatory control over it to some degree. And they're exercising that. And you know, the conversation about the degree to which media companies, tech companies, if you will, the degree to which tech companies should give a backdoor to national security institutions is an ongoing debate everywhere, not just in Russia. And in Russia, obviously, they tend to favor the national security side of the argument. So this is more a manifestation of that sort of institutional conversation, like which institution should have favor, what are institutional responsibilities. And the Russian government has basically dictated that tech companies should be deferential towards national security needs. And in so much as Telegram is not adhering to that preference, they're coming under attack for that reason. I find it a bit interesting that the Russian government is struggling to really make it work, though. I find that interesting. There had been, before, you know, the whole populist kind of era started, you know, 10 years ago or whenever, there had been a lot of talk about the death of the state and how non-state actors were going to kind of inherit the earth, and that we would live in a global society would be defined more by non-state actors than by state actors. And this is kind of an interesting manifestation of that old conversation that's kind of fallen by the wayside. The conversation now is more about the state coming back, and the state, you know, how is the state going to reassert its new authority? But harkening back to the old conversation, this is an interesting example of state authority competing with the authority of a non-state authority. And it's actually not entirely working out in the favor of the state, which kind of suggests there may still be some merit to the notion of non-state actors being at least near competitors at some point in the future to state actors, with big repercussions in the future as far as representation, policy, etc. I don't think the Russians really see them as an enemy per se. I think it is just more of a legal maneuver, more of a policy decision than anything. And I don't think they're moving towards a Chinese-type model where they have like a great firewall. They are attempting to implement censorship in Russia, and they have some ambiguously written, wide-ranging, what amount to censorship laws to that effect. But it's nothing so severe as in what's in China. They might make a move to something like a Chinese model in the future, but for now they seem to be kind of in between, basically, with some censorship, but not absolute. I guess the Great Wall isn't absolute. Well, the Great Firewall, as it's called in China, is not absolute itself, but it's a lot more than in Russia. It's a lot more powerful than in Russia. Oh, thank you, Sea of Whiskey, for the recommendation. Let's see. Tech Dirt. I'll open a tab with that, just so I don't forget. Let's see. Internet neutrality ends tomorrow. What do you expect will happen in the US when it does? I would not expect a whole lot, because dramatic movement would guarantee a backlash. Now, if you're a tech company and you really want to, well, if you're a telecoms company and you really want to exploit the absence of net neutrality, the rule change basically to the fullest, then what you're going to do is you're going to take more of a boil the frog approach. You're going to introduce changes slowly, so that over time you can kind of get to where you want to be without incurring a backlash that reverses the change in the short term. I suspect that eventually, if Democrats do well in the upcoming midterm elections, or, you know, at some point in the future, there's going to be Democrats in power again, you know, at some point. And when they do, I suspect the rule will be changed back. So at that juncture, you'll kind of see a return of net neutrality or something resembling it. But for now, I doubt there will be dramatic one-day change. You know, I would be surprised if there were. Maybe there will be. Again, I'm not a tech guy, so maybe some of the tech people listening would have more insight on that count. But at least for the moment, politically, it would be risky. And I don't know that there would be a huge amount of economic gains they could get from it, at least right away. Let's see. Do you think the 2001 to 2003 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq contributed to the rise of ISIS and increased presence of Islamic terrorism in general? Yeah, they definitely did. I mean, they didn't help. They certainly couldn't have helped. In Afghanistan, it's a little less cut and dry, because in Afghanistan they were had more free reign. Al-Qaeda had more free reign under the Taliban's regime. They have rather less now, but you could argue that there's more political violence and terrorism in Afghanistan since the war started than there was under the Taliban. You know, still violence under the Taliban, but it was at least controlled violence. Whereas with Iraq, it pretty explicitly empowered radical elements in the region, shall we say. So certainly that did encourage, well, maybe not encourage, but it did facilitate. It, you know, it kind of inculcated a lot more terrorist activity than had been present before under the previous Hussein regime. I don't think the war in Afghanistan contributed to the rise of ISIS, though. I think that's more explicitly an Iraqi phenomenon. ISIS itself evolved out of an organization called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were pretty explicitly Al-Qaeda's branch in Iraq for a while, and they just got to be so brutal that even Al-Qaeda broke with them, basically. You know, they just did not approve of their tactics and strategy. They didn't see it as sustainable. And so Al-Qaeda in Iraq evolved over time into ISIS. Well, not even evolved over time. They were Al-Qaeda in Iraq basically up until the Syrian civil war broke out, and then they moved over, and then they declared themselves the Islamic State. Actually, I think they were, yeah, like you say, ISIS. Islamic State something, Al-Sham, I think was the original name. But that's how they got started. They did kind of come out of that insurgent environment, the environment of the Iraq War from 2003 to 2010, roughly, whenever you want to say it ended. But I don't think they have as much relationship to Afghanistan. Now, the increased presence of Islamic terrorism in general. Now, that's more debatable, because you could argue that there was already radical elements in place. I mean, if you want to talk in terms of terrorist activity, definitely. There's definitely been a lot more terrorist activity than there would have been otherwise, if you had not had the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But whether or not there are more terrorists, per se, well, yeah, you would probably say there were more terrorists, too, because it's more easy to recruit, it's more open. But whether or not there's more sentiment, whether or not there's more radical sentiment, let's put it like that, you could argue that it's probably the same amount as was before, that it was just suppressed before, and now it's out in the open. You know, this kind of ties into an overarching conversation about how best to suppress terrorism in the Middle East. And we've talked a bit about this before in previous segments, I guess. And you know, one of the arguments is that authoritarian regimes are best because they can clamp down on the population and prevent, you know, terrorist actors of one sort or another from operating freely, from fundraising, and from recruiting. You know, the criticism there is that the principal reason there are terrorist actors in the region to begin with is because of those authoritarian governments. It's not as though people in the region were all terrorists and then authoritarians came and suppressed them and tried to reform them. That's an almost colonial perspective. You know, that's like a proxy colonialism in which you have sort of these third worlders who need to be bettered by some kind of moderate secular people in their own country, and, you know, as opposed to Westerners coming in doing the colonizing. You have proxy colonizers instead doing the work. I don't think that's the case. You know, more likely there was pre-existing political tensions in these countries, and rather than resolve them peacefully, governments came to power that resolved them through repression. And repression, as has been shown numerous times in history, has a radicalizing effect. You know, the longer the repression lasts and the harsher it is, the more radicalized people become. Such that ideologies like, say, classical liberalism or even socialism or what have you become discredited as they fail to exact change, and so people just become more and more alienated and violent. So authoritarianism, I don't think, is the real long-term answer there, even if it does provide some short-term gain. It mitigates the level of terrorist activity, sure, but over the long term, it's not going to last. Sooner or later, something's going to happen to the regime, and those underlying political tensions are going to explode. It would be much better if you are going to take the approach of working with authoritarian regimes to not only empower them and their national security apparatus, but to try to reform them, to try to get them to improve their governance and economic management. Over time, that would improve the circumstances in individual countries in the Middle East much more than if you take a purely repressive approach. that would be ideal, but I don't know how much the countries in the region want that, because good economic management and good governance is kind of at odds with the maintenance of a strong patronage network. And like we were talking about before, a lot of countries in the region have leaders or parties who depend on patronage networks to maintain power. And so if faced with the choice between perpetual repression and possible occasional revolt, possibly violent civil war, that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, maintaining their power. Well, not maintaining their power, but basically dismantling their patronage network, possibly being thrown out of power as part of a move towards liberalization over the long term. A lot of actors would probably choose the former. They would probably rather go with repression, since that's what keeps them at power. It's not a favorable trade-off to them to just give up power and then leave. And so it could be argued that even if the West wanted to take that approach of trying to encourage them to reform in exchange for military support, they themselves, the actors in the country, in the region rather, may reject such an approach. And unfortunately, the West doesn't seem to want to do that anyway. There seems to be a reluctance to get engaged with the region. As a result, there's not a lot happening either which way. There's not a lot of really working directly with authoritarian regimes to kind of stamp out terrorism, nor is there any real substantive work to try to pressure them to change such that terrorism is mitigated over the long term. I guess the gist of what I'm saying here is that authoritarianism is not the answer to terrorism. It's not really a good solution. That would be my argument. Everybody has to make that judgment for themselves. I won't tell you explicitly what to believe, but that's just my perspective. You know, you kind of have to come to your own conclusion there. But in general, to get back to the question, yeah, I think the wars didn't help. You know, certainly the incidence of terrorism and terrorist groups in the Middle East has risen, partly because those wars overthrew establishment regimes that had been containing those tensions and political forces. Let's see, what's your opinion on the role of sweatshops / low-wage manufacturing in developing third world economies, replacing sustenance farming? Like Krugman's famous In Defense of Sweatshops Opinions article. I haven't read that article. I'll have to look it up, though. Copy-paste that. Let's see. Krugman, if I remember correctly, has a Nobel Prize in economics stemming from his research on international trade. And given the status quo on international trade, I'm going to guess that his article probably argued that sweatshop manufacturing, low-wage manufacturing, is probably a net positive, even if it comes with costs for developing countries. I don't differ in that regard. I have a background in economics. I've at least been trained as an economics, even if I'm not an economist, paid economist explicitly right now. But my perspective is pretty much the same. Subsistence farming is not a great way to live. It can provide you with a lot of social stability, a nice, community, etc. But it can leave you very vulnerable in terms of if there's a bad harvest, if there's a significant change in commodity prices, it can be very tough. And you're never going to get rich doing it. Your quality of life is not going to significantly improve. So the standard of living for somebody who works in a sweatshop is not great, obviously. But it at least gives those people a vector, a path to follow in which they can save up some money and try to do something more. A lot of people who work in sweatshops save some of their money and send it back as remittances to where they came from. And that money helps pay for things like community improvements, infrastructure, etc., healthcare, what have you. So all of that is money that they would not have otherwise. So on the one hand, it's not an ideal solution. It's not great. It's not a good way to live. It is exploitative. But on the other hand, if you have to choose between that and nothing, a lot of people would choose that. Of course, that's a matter of discretion. People have to judge that for themselves. It's a matter of individual opinion. But in the developing world, a lot of workers would prefer to have that money than not have it. Now, is it a great way to develop an economy? Not particularly. I mean, it kind of depends on who owns the sweatshop in question, what kind of goods they're producing, whether or not there's a long-term plan for development, whether or not they're investing in the business. There's a lot of different variables there. Over the long term, it's possible for an economy largely dependent on low-wage manufacturing to move up the value chain, but it's very difficult to do, and it doesn't happen a whole lot. China is trying to do that. They might even be succeeding. If they did, that would be a significant breakthrough economically, as far as I know. Very few countries have done that. The Asian tigers did it, but they got stuck at the middle income trap. A lot of the Asian tigers basically used to be low-wage manufacturers, and then they developed their economy, moved up the value chain, such that they produce high-value goods now. But their GDP per capita kind of got hung up on a middle income level. So in Europe and the United States, GDP per cap is like 50K, 60K, more in that realm. But Asian tigers generally have GDP per caps more in the realm of like 30K, 40K. And that's not bad, but it's still not quite at par. And there's some question as to why they haven't been able to quite make the jump to par with the rest of the developed world. That's kind of an open question in economics, or at least it was when I was learning economics. I've been out of the loop for a while, so maybe somebody's produced some new research on that count. But that's what I remember anyway. So in general, that's my perspective on the role of sweatshops, low-wage manufacturing, in developing third world economies. It's a net positive. It's not great, but it's better than nothing in a lot of cases. And it can be a long-term positive or a long-term negative, depending on who the factory owners are and how they operate, how much they're investing in the economy, etc. That's more of a case-by-case thing. Let's see, what would be some of the short-term implications on foreign countries if the U.S. suddenly shut down all exporting operations of trade goods? So some of that would be welcome, because the United States, some countries produce goods that compete with American exports. For those countries, that would be a boon, because they would pick up that market share in the export markets. So like German cars wouldn't have to compete with American cars in export markets, so then German cars could eat up that market share. That's great for Germany. Japan, similar. So in cases of high-value goods, that would be very good for the rest of the world's developed economies, developed economy competitors. If you're going to stop, what was it, all exports, I think it was, all exporting operations of trade goods, I'm guessing that would not then extend to financial exports. Whenever somebody outside of the United States gives money to an investment bank to invest their money, or to otherwise just manage their money, that's technically an American export, because that's money coming in, right? In the same way that money would come in if you sold an actual good overseas. But generally when people talk about the trade in goods, they don't include financial services, and it's not generally included in current accounts deficit. When people talk about the trade deficit, they're really talking about the current accounts deficit. But the current accounts deficit only focuses on basically physical goods traded across the border. It does not include intangible services like finance, like financial products. Financial products fall more under the reserve account. And when you combine the reserve account with the current accounts, then you get the balance of payments, which is the total, basically, trade of a given country. So people tend to emphasize the current accounts deficit because that's the more dramatic number. The United States has a very large current accounts deficit, but it actually has a surplus in the reserve account, and that surplus actually largely negates the current accounts deficit. So on the net, the United States does not have that big a deficit. The total balance of payments is in the negative only by like $1 billion or so dollars. At least it was the last time I checked. I might be getting that wrong. It's been a while, but it's pretty marginal. For a $17 trillion economy, being $1 billion short every year isn't a big deal. So the trade deficit is not like a huge problem per se, like it's often made out to be. Kind of getting off on a tangent here. What was the original question? Cutting off all trade. Yeah. So America's high-value good competitors, they benefit. We're not going to count financial trade because I assume you're talking about physical goods. The biggest problem and impact would probably be in terms of food, because the United States is the world's largest exporter of food. It's actually not the world's largest producer of food. China is the world's largest producer of food, but it consumes everything it makes, or at least the vast majority of what it makes, and it doesn't actually make enough to entirely feed itself, to entirely be self-sufficient. So China is the world's, I think, top importer of food, of agricultural products. So one thing that would happen is quite possibly starvation, because the United States, on the margin, produces a good chunk of food that a lot of countries can't produce themselves. For countries that have to import food, they would find imports more expensive. if the United States cut off that export trade. And that could be a big problem for them. You know, we saw what happened. Part of the reason the Arab Spring happened was food prices skyrocketed, and that was partly because oil prices had been high. That created tensions. Even after the financial crisis, food prices were still pretty high, even afterwards. And financial crisis caused the oil price to crash, which you might think would make food prices fall, but they fell off and then increased again later. Partly that had to do with regulation, bad economic regulation. I'm going off on a tangent again. The point is, I'm not even entirely sure where I was going with that now. But the point was, yeah, if you cut off exports and agricultural goods, that's a big problem for people who, oh, that's what it was. Countries who import food and are dependent on food imports would face substantially higher prices, and there could then result political instability from people upset by the fall in their living conditions caused by higher food prices. So potentially instability in food importing countries and much higher prices probably for everybody. There could be a problem for countries dependent on exports to the United States. Countries like, say, Germany and Japan that export a lot to the United States could face a problem that would not then be offset by increase in market share in other markets by the loss of the American market. The U.S. is, I think, one of, if not the top consumption market. I'm not sure if China has overtaken it yet, but it's up there. And losing such a huge consumer would be a big toll for a lot of producers around the world. So that would hurt a lot of developed industries, a lot of high-value industries that produce things like cars and what have you that the United States imports a lot of. So I'm not sure whether the effect of losing the U.S. consumer market, the degree to which that would offset the gain in market share from cutting off American exports. But then you didn't say cut off American imports, you said cut off exports specifically. Short-term implications on foreign countries if the U.S. shut down exports. So they could still export to the United States then in this example. I assume that's what you mean. If you mean just cut off all trade, that's different. That's autarky. But if other countries can still export to the United States, they're basically just gaining. They get to keep that American market share and pick up the market share that the U.S. is giving up by dropping exports. If I'm getting the gist of the question, well, if I'm not getting the gist of the question, please feel free to elaborate, and I'd be happy to return to it. But I think that's pretty much it. That is my rough prediction of what would happen if that happened. And mind you, the world economy is hugely complex. There's a huge number of supply chains that interconnect across borders, and so all of that would be disrupted, and that would be just a huge problem in and of itself. But given that the world economy is so massive and complex, I would be hard-pressed to kind of give a really good, confident prediction as to what would happen exactly. There's just too much economy there to really kind of summarize succinctly.
So just as a reference, we probably have about 10 to 15 minutes.
Gotcha. All right, we've only got a couple left, so I'll try to blow through here.
All right.
What do you think about the divide in public opinion in America? It seems as though there are roughly two groups of people who actively hate the other and everything the other stands for, basically along party lines. Is such a divide healthy or sustainable, or is it necessary to resolve it somehow? And how would you even go about that? Yeah, we've talked a bit about this before, I think in some of the earlier segments. Yeah, there is a lot more partisanship. There's a lot of factors that go into that, the hyper-partisan media landscape, which is partly because of the decline in the business environment, which we talked about a little bit ago. But also just more information, making people more aware of how the system works, and more people being more aware, wanting to impact that system, having their own preferences, and trying to exact those preferences on the system. I think a lot of it is just people are unfamiliar with how to do politics. Traditionally, politics was largely managed by politicians operating more or less isolated in Washington or other political centers, negotiating among themselves, and then basically being interlocutors between various different interest groups. Now, though, there's more and more democratization, such that average people are more and more directly involved in politics. And people are not really aware, I think, the broader public is not really aware, I think, the degree to which compromise colored politics under the previous regime. When you have politics just by politicians, there is probably more corruption, no doubt, but there's also more compromise, and there's a recognition that compromise is necessary in order to get anything done, in order to have a state, not only to get things done, but to have a stable system in which outcomes are predictable and people are not constantly anxious about what's going to happen. There's a lot of value in that. I don't think that's quite understood by the newly empowered broader public. I think the broader public is still learning how to interact with people who disagree with them. And that kind of, there's sort of a national learning process going on as a result of the information revolution, in which people are sort of learning that. And I think it'll take maybe another 10, 20 years, maybe another generation, before the information kind of filters through and the broader public kind of reaches an understanding of the norms of politics that are necessary to adhere to beyond just the rules of politics in order to maintain a stable political system in which compromise is a norm and an accepted norm. So that's an opinion, not a fact. That's speculation on my part. But that's roughly how I think it would play out. You don't necessarily have to do anything to try to reconcile the factions if that is a correct characterization of the problem. But whether or not you want to do something or should do something to try to make peace between the warring factions, so to speak, in the United States is a matter of opinion. That just depends on what kind of outcome you want. If you want a more peaceful system in which norms are adhered to and recognized, then yeah, by all means go out and proselytize. On the other hand, if you think the other side is pure evil, the devil incarnate, and they have to be stopped at all costs, well, I can't tell you you're wrong. That's also a matter of an opinion. It's at your discretion the degree to which you want to do that. So, I mean, again, this is a matter of judgment. Like, the degree to which one side or the other is right or wrong is a matter of opinion. Liberal democracy has historically encouraged the norm of recognizing that there's a limit to what you should do, even if you have the ability to do it. That's sort of the idea behind constitutional democracy as opposed to majoritarian democracy. So ideally, that norm would eventually filter down and be recognized and understood by the broader population. But the mechanism by which that happens, whether it be proselytizing by interested parties, or if it's going to happen naturally, I don't know. I can't really say. I would say it's not healthy. I think that much is clear. History provides plenty of examples of divided countries being destabilized by hyperpolarization of that variety, of different interest groups being unable to negotiate their differences in a way that is conducive to a peaceful outcome and a return to stability. So, not healthy. Is it sustainable? No, I don't think it's sustainable either, because I think it's fundamentally disequilibria. Kind of like what I just explained. It's a result of changing structural variables in the politics, in the economy, in the society at large. And I think we're trending towards an eventual equilibrium, but I don't think anybody knows what that equilibrium in the future will look like. But I don't think it's sustainable for that reason. It's going to change somehow. Either it's going to just fall apart completely, and that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, everything returns to the status quo. Most likely, it's going to be something in between where you have a new equilibria, in which there's a new dynamic, a new understanding of the system as a whole, embraced by everybody, by the broader population. Again, whether or not it's necessary to resolve it or what have you, subjective. And I don't know how to go about it. So that's a meandering answer. I tend to give those. I'm sorry if that's not entirely satisfying. I am trying to rush a little bit, but
that's
hopefully
part of
that
what
kind
we
of
offer here.
Yeah, but hopefully that kind of gets to the gist of it. Hopefully that is at least a relatively decent answer. Do you have any book recommendations for super broad world history in a nutshell? I got Guns, Germs, and Steel, but it went too in-depth on random topics I didn't care about, and I stopped halfway through. I generally don't do big picture history. Generally, I do prefer the more focused historical case studies. And, if you do enough of them over time, you kind of get the big picture inherently. So, I would recommend... I don't know what to recommend if you want to do, like, the big picture world history thing, because I don't really do that. I don't have anything I can reference for that, at least not off the top of my head. I would recommend instead that you focus on regions, like South Asian civilization, European civilization, the history of the Western Hemisphere, Chinese civilization. If you kind of focus in on those kind of poles, I think you're better served. I think that'll kind of give you a better big picture. Because if you aggregate into the whole, then you're losing a lot of important detail. On the other hand, if you get too detailed, then you're losing the bigger picture, which is why I think the regional focus is better. You kind of get a little bit of both. And then after you do it for a while, then you kind of start to see the connections between them. But I don't know that there's any, like, one good source that I would point to. That's not a great answer, I know, but I haven't read like a whole lot on that. Most of the stuff I read is very specific, targeted stuff that is a very particular country's history or politics or what have you. Let's see, are you familiar with and what do you think of the world island theory of geopolitics? What was that? That sounds familiar, but I'm not sure I can conjure it. I think that's different than the Eurasian theory, right? The Eurasian thing was where anyone who controls the Eurasian landmass, the Eurasian interior, rules the world because that's really important for some reason. That's an old theory way back from the 19th century. I think the world island theory of geopolitics is different, but I'm not sure I can remember it off the top of my head. Let's search with Google. Maybe I can get my motor running here. Oh, I think that is it. Yeah, this is right, the pivot area in Eurasia. Yeah, it's the same thing. So that is the theory. Yeah, that's bullshit. That's full stop archaic Victorian nonsense. There's no reason that the Eurasian hinterland, Central Asia, is so uniquely important as to empower whoever controls it to kind of be the dominant world power. You know, there's not a lot there, for one. There's just not a lot of resources. There's not a lot of infrastructure to get to the resources that are there. I mean, yeah, I don't think there's a lot of substance to the debate. I think it was more about, I think the core of the argument was more about Russia, more than anything. You know, Russia's going to control all of this territory. They'll have so many resources, so much manpower. Whoever controls all that will surely be the dominant power. That's not really how power dynamics work, though. Russia has a lot of strength in numbers, but historically they've lacked a bit in quality. They've been a little too dependent on numbers in many conflicts. Generally, world powers have been more those that have had, at least over the past few hundred, have been more those world powers that have had a stronger tie into the world commercial network, the world trade. There was a big commercial revolution a few centuries ago in which basically all the world became one market. And it's just been constantly shrinking since then into a tighter and tighter integrated globe. And that change kind of shifted the impetus of power away from traditional control of land and manpower and towards control of the flow of capital, the flow of trade, etc. You know, those who were able to harness large amounts of capital, large amounts of money, were able to marshal and pay for much larger forces than people who were dependent on the traditional feudal system. And the emergence of capital markets in Europe really gave them an advantage in that regard. That was one of the reasons Western Europe became as powerful as they were. They didn't have as much land or land power as Russia, China, etc., but they had a lot more money concentrated in a much smaller space, and they were able to leverage that much greater access to capital in order to undermine the feudal societies in these other countries. Like, there was no real defense in feudal India or feudal China to these very wealthy economic actors coming in and undermining their traditional political system. That was probably inevitable. That was going to happen sooner or later. You know, it may not have been the Europeans, but as soon as somebody figured out that you can create a capital market and harness all of those resources, that was it for feudal political systems. Because feudal political systems just have no counter to that. I mean, in a feudal political system, loyalty is very mercenary. Whoever has the most land and most men can nominally keep a lid on things, but it's an inherently unstable political. And anybody who can come in with just inordinate amounts of cash and just pay off people under you to turn on you, that's it. They're the new power. Like, you can't counter that. You just don't have that kind of money as a landlord. So the world island theory is predicated on this notion that land is more important than capital and trade, and the commercial revolution in the 1600s kind of turned that on its head. And yeah, I don't think it really even had merit in the Victorian era when they kind of came up with it. Geopolitics is not a field of science. I don't know how many people realize that. That's not like an actual academic thing. That's more of a pseudoscience that just anybody and everybody can do.
It's maybe a field of memes.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there are people with a lot of expertise who do a lot of geopolitical analysis, but there is no field of geopolitics per se, and really just anybody can do it. You can go onto Reddit and just spout nonsense about geopolitics, and technically that's as legitimate as anybody else's analysis. There's no like accreditation you can get for geopolitics, at least as far as I know. So that's it for questions.
Nice job. Hammered some out. Tonight was fun. It seemed like we got through a lot of big stuff. There was some repeat, but a lot of it was pretty fresh, pretty new. I think that may kind of add to the feeling a little scatterbrained because you go all over the world. Some days we'll kind of get stuck on gun control.
Yeah.
Makes it easier to follow, but it's also less interesting. So this was good.
Got some breadth to it.
Yeah, the games that I had were hilarious too, which I think helps. Yeah.
Well, just before we go here, I wanted to... I'm still making the podcast. I'm working on new episodes. I know it's been like 2.5 months since the last ones, but I am working on it, and it's just to give a light preview. It's going to be post-war collective treaty defense organizations for the United States. Basically, it's going to be the early history of NATO and the Rio Treaty.
Nice.
Just a quick preview there. That's what's being worked on. I'm going to try to get that done at some point.
Well, I would guess that most of us don't know shit about that, so we'll have to check it out.
Yeah. But thanks for having me. A lot of fun.
Yep. We'll plug your stuff again. Follow him on Twitter. You get some bite-sized stuff throughout the week when we're not doing these big episodes where we cover a lot of stuff. It'll just be an article and some of his thoughts. There's a SoundCloud. But yeah, every Sunday we do this. If you're new and you haven't seen this segment before, it's a lot of fun. Thanks everyone for the support during it. We got a couple hosts, quite a few subs, got a donation as well. Thanks very much everyone. And Fuzzy Cord for handling the questions. Excellent work there. So, on that note, have an awesome week, Agent Smith. Great having you on.
You too. Yep, thanks again.
Who was that? Who was that man who was talking? What's going on?